the gang Trey Dargawa from the Trans de Argawa gang.
Rob, do you want to try and pronounce her name?
Trans de Argawa, right? Like
Last chance to say Trenderagua.
Tren de Argawa. Did I get it right? No.
Welcome, everybody, to another Rattlesnake TV debate night. We have got with us today Rob Noerr and Adam Khan, and we're going to be debating the topic, has Trump's his second term, been a success so far? It's good to see you both. We'll get some quick intros as to who you are for those of you guys who are seeing you the first time, and we'll start off with you, Rob.
Yeah, my name's Rob Noerr. I am a populist conservative that lives in rural Pennsylvania. I've lived in the same area within 20 miles my whole life. Did policy debate in college, ran for Congress here in Pennsylvania, and stream is a hobby. My full-time job is doing home health care with adults with disabilities. Love debating, so I'm really looking forward tonight, and I always appreciate doing a show with Jake. Adam, my first time meeting you, so I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Always a pleasure, never a chore, Rob. And Adam, good to see you again. Thanks for coming back on the channel.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm Adam Khan. I'd call myself probably a progressive, but with political labels, it's always a little bit tough to pick the right one. I do political commentary mainly on TikTok, starting to move a little bit more to YouTube. And I've been in a few Jubilee videos and a couple more coming out in a few months.
Awesome. And all of the links for these gentlemen will be below. So, guys, we're going to do opening statements. That'll be 5 minutes each on the clock for these fellas. And then we're going to get into open dialogue for at least about 90 minutes or so. These guys can take it wherever they please. If you would like to send some super chats and grease my palms, you're more than welcome to do so. And the super chats will be put on screen as we go. And with that, gentlemen, let's get ready to rumble.
And now, for the thousands in attendance, let's get ready to rumble!
Rob, the floor is yours.
All right.
On the clock.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. So, should be a good debate this evening. The question is, has the beginning here of Trump's term been a success? Now, it's very difficult to be able to determine this early into an administration how things will end up. And the term success is going to be relative anyways. I would propose that one of the ways we determine whether or not it's a success is comparing it to other similar administrations in this country, maybe in the past 30, 40 years. Maybe we can go back further if we like. But it's difficult because I think that most of our governments in the United States have failed us spectacularly, not just at the national level, but at the state level. And even in my case, and I assume in most cases at the local level as well. So when I'm talking about it being a success, largely I'm going to be talking about it being marginally better than what we saw with previous administrations, whether it be the last Republican administration of W. Bush or the administrations of Obama, Joe Biden, etc. I think that to be completely honest, the one area that I want to see more that's most important to me that I will need to see before I say for me and what I want this is a success is I want to see corruption outed in our institutions. It is my belief that globalists are running our country, that the real power is bureaucracies behind the scenes, that they stay in perpetuity, individual politicians leave, they're unaccountable, and that's where the real power lies. They use lawfare to go after people they don't like. Chuck Schumer told us that you can't criticize groups like the FBI, even if you're the president of the United States, because they will be corrupt and going after you. And therefore, until that is usurped, the people, whether they be progressive, populist, Christian, whatever you want, whatever label, they will not have a voice. And instead, we will be ruled by the whims of unelected bureaucrats that continually enrich themselves, the wealthy class, and it put into sort of our society what I think are terrible policies that are secularist, that lead to our culture going in a bad way. Having said that, the successes that I'll isolate are basically threefold that I think that are primary, but we'll be able to go further than that and talk about other issues if Adam likes. I certainly want to give him an opportunity to talk about topics that he wants to. The first area of success I think that you could isolate, which is an easy victory, and one of the most important topics is the border. We were lied to by these bureaucrats, both in the Democratic parties and for years in the Republican parties, that said that we just had to exist with our porous border, bringing in people that massively change our culture and are massive drains on our society, in addition to rapidly making the country more dangerous. We're told over and over that all the academics, which again fall into those institutionalists that are bureaucrats, like our bureaucrats that are unaccountable, they all tell us how great all of these illegals are. And yet every time we send them anywhere, the people in those communities clamor for them to get out. When it was just conservative districts that were predominantly Hispanic, we laughed at them and said, shut up, suck it up. You have a town of 1,000 people. You just got 3,000 people that don't speak the language. So what? You're Hispanic. You'll like it. They said, no, we don't like it. We came here legally. We did the right thing. We don't want these people. Then when we started sending them to Martha's Vineyard and sent them to places like Chicago, all of a sudden people that are traditionally Democrats and not white nationalists started to say that they didn't like those people either. So you can see that the studies are alive that talk about how great they are. And the fact that we had to have a bipartisan bill after 3 years of the Biden administration allowing millions to flow through the border and him saying that there wasn't a crisis, bragging that his first day in office that he rescinded executive orders that massively restricted the amount of illegal immigration that was occurring. We saw that he finally, in an election year, saw that it was a huge loss for him and the American people had had enough. So he pushes for this bipartisan bill that would have had so many problems, but at the minimum would have allowed 4,000 people a day enshrined into coming before it would have went into effect and the government could have done anything. To which the Democrats who want those people here anyways would say, oh, you signed off on it. It was bipartisan. Those people are legal. Now you can't kick them out. And so the fact that all it took was changing a president to lower that number where we had millions coming across the border to historic lows where we're looking at like some 3,000 a month as opposed to tens of thousands in some days that we're coming across is a huge victory. If we don't solve that problem, our country will radically change. The second area that I could say that Trump is a success is that he understands that the dollar being the world reserve currency, the massive debt that we're building up, and the hollowing out of manufacturing in the United States and relying on countries like China is not sustainable. This country will cease to exist as a world power or as the sole world power, and we will have to rely on China, which a progressive like Adam should find appalling because their record on human rights is going to be far worse than the United States. They are positioning to be the world superpower because they control manufacturing, and through manipulation, tariffs, and other trade barriers, and the fact that so much manufacturing occurs there, the United States is quickly going to have to rely on them, not just for guns, steel, ammunition, but actually for the medical products that we need if a virus is released from a place like China. Oh, by the way, it was. Pay no heed to the fact that the former president's son bragged about working for the, and I'm quoting now, spy chief of China. So doing that and trying to have a tariff policy that makes the United States manufacturing is one of the most important things he could do. The last thing I'll say, and maybe the most important, is Trump's administration, for no other reason, has been a success because it has pissed off the worst people. And it has showed us culturally that we're tired of things like the trans agenda. We're tired of these scumbag secularists that push all of this crap on our children, that push all of these terrible policies that make our country so terrible. They're losing and taking fat L after fat L. Democrats' approval rating at this point is at historic lows. Some polls have them as low as 21%. And that's occurring in a time where Trump's trying to radically change policy that's leading to short-term shifts in the stock market. So if anything, you would expect people to be flocking to the Democratic Party. But they have been outed as so disgusting, it's so anti-American, it's so secularist that people are no longer swallowing the crap. The days of screaming racism, the days of screaming that white people are evil, Christians are evil, we need to have drag shows for children are over. Oh, sorry, I didn't know.
Right.
But yeah, that's it. That's my opening statement. Sorry.
You got 6 minutes on the clock, Adam. We're
Sure,
a little
yeah.
bit over, so go for it.
Yeah, probably not going to take up the full 6 minutes. I agree with Rob that the sort of key question here is how do we even define success in the first place, because that sets the parameters of what matters and what doesn't matter. I would take a little bit different of a look at it in the sense that I would judge success based on what is sort of the reason someone got elected, and then what did they do within the powers that they have to effectuate that type of change. I'm not opposed to talking about previous administrations. I'd rather avoid this becoming like a whataboutism type of debate where we're like, well, this guy did this and this guy did that. I call myself a progressive and not necessarily a Democrat because I do have criticisms of Democrats. So I'm not going to just blindly defend anything that any Democrat has ever done. I think that there are valid critiques of the Biden administration as it pertains to immigration. I think he course corrected maybe a little bit too late, and that's a valid justification. I do think that when it comes broadly to immigration, the actual question here is how is this being done? And I think we're seeing a serious erosion of due process in this country. I'm sure we're going to get to the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia and what sort of risks that poses to our constitutional rights. I would say also some of the promises of mass deportation are not being borne out in the numbers. Like they're maybe marginally higher some days, marginally lower some days. I will admit that the border encounters are down dramatically. That is true. And I think that probably is in a large part because of Trump. But when it comes to actual detentions and deportations, I'm not seeing a real rhyme and reason here when we're invoking things like the Alien Enemies Act to deport people without due process. Many of them don't even have a criminal record. So what exactly are the priorities of this administration as it pertains to immigration? I'd also talk about, he mentioned tariffs. I think that's a very big part of what Trump ran on. He talks about it constantly. He said it's his favorite word in the dictionary. These tariffs have been nothing short of disastrous. There's not even a coherent message on why we have them. Half of MAGA seems to think they're a means to an end. They're a negotiating tactic. The other half seems to think, no, this is the end goal. Tariffs are great for raising revenue and onshoring jobs. I take issue with that as well. As someone who has a degree in economics, I can promise you tariffs are one of the worst ways to reindustrialize. They're one of the worst ways to have economic leverage in many cases. They can antagonize other countries. They can push other countries into the arms of China. They can scare away investors. A lot of companies right now are terrified to do any kind of capital expenditure because they don't know if tomorrow we're going to have a 40% tariff, a 0% tariff, or a pause. That paralyzes business investment, job creation. And in many cases, they're thinking, why am I going to bring a factory to the US when maybe 5 years down the line, we have a new president who gets rid of the tariffs? And then I just spent all this money onshoring jobs that are going to end up costing more and cutting into my profit margins. And the last thing I would say is that his tax plan, I think, is also incoherent. And the sort of like main topics I would want to touch on here are, I think the economic policy is incoherent. And I think Trump was elected because of the economy. That was the primary reason. Immigration is also in the top two there. And then I would also say that he represents a serious threat to our constitutional order, to our checks and balances. And that to me is the biggest issue here, because we can disagree on like what is the optimal tax rate and what is the best way to do deportations and what's the best immigration policy. And those are very important discussions to have, but they have to exist within the context of a president who believes in rule of law and is not blatantly defying court orders and ignoring the power of the purse in Congress and going through and firing inspectors general illegally. I mean, there's a lot we can get into here, but just broadly speaking, I'd say authoritarianism and the economy are the two biggest issues with this administration.
All right, fellas. Well, we'll make sure we get into all those topics. And with that, let's kick it into open dialogue.
Adam, I'll give you the chance. You could pick the first area that you want to go in. I know we've talked about like immigration, the border, economy, authoritarianism.
Well, since this is a hot topic in the news, let's talk about Kilmar Abrego Garcia and the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act. I think that, number one, invoking the Alien Enemies Act to deport those people made no sense when it says a foreign nation or a government either declares war or invades. Tren de Aragua, I don't think can be classified as a foreign nation or government. I think there were two intelligence agencies that had said there was insufficient evidence to classify them as such. The FBI did disagree with that, so there's maybe some valid disagreement in that classification. The fact that they were given no due process, the fact that they defied James Boasberg's orders, if they can't turn the planes around, there's not enough fuel, park the plane, refuel, come back. He wasn't saying you can't do this. He was saying put a 14-day pause on this, make sure these people have due process. Now he's considering holding them in contempt of court. And the Supreme Court also had said that Trump has to facilitate the return of Garcia and also provide updates as to what steps he's taken. Trump has made clear he does not want to do that. Bukele has said he can't do that, which makes absolutely no sense. And I'm curious to see if Rob thinks that this is all justified or not.
I don't think that any of this would speak broadly to an overarching success. At best, if I concede everything you're saying here, we would end up to a position that the Trump administration has done one slight percentage of violating something like due process that presidents in the past, particularly Democrats, have done, that were cheered on by almost all of these same people screaming bloody murder, including lawyers and judges. For example, would you admit that Garcia, let's just go through some facts of Garcia real quick. He was not an American citizen. You'll admit that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he had
a withholding from removal order in 2019.
He had a withholding from removal only to the country of El Salvador. The deportation order still stood, though, correct?
Sure, but wouldn't the deportation typically be to their home country? So where else would you deport him to?
Well, there's the rub. Don't worry, we'll get to that. There's the rub.
Sure.
What's going to happen is we'll see that people, I don't know you specifically, but Democrats and people that are making arguments similar to what you're making here, the real game is, just like it wasn't a mistake, whoopsie, we let 15 million people in. The real game is we're going to make it impossible to deport any of these people. So, for example, just to spell at the end of the game, people will argue, these same lawyers, ACO, etc., that are arguing, well, we can't send Garcia back because he's fearful of a gang. The next argument they'll make is, well, we can't send him back because he's fearful of the government of El Salvador, because they run torture prisons. Would you agree with that they run torture prisons?
From what I've seen, yeah, places like CCOT have like serious human rights
Okay,
abuses.
so then every illegal immigrant that comes from El Salvador will say, we're afraid to go back. To which Democrats would say it would be monstrous to send them back. And then they'll say, but you can't send them to another country because that would
Sure.
be
Well,
inhumane
it's
as
not
well.
on Democrats to make these decisions. This is judges to adjudicate. And it's important to know that actually the standard to get a withholding from removal is actually a higher standard than getting an asylum case approved. For asylum, I think it's that you have a credible fear that you're going to be persecuted for an immutable characteristic if you're deported. For a withholding of removal order, there has to be more likely than not that you will face some kind of risk. And that's a adjudication made by a judge.
I have no problem getting into the details in this, and I will, but I just want to set the
Sure.
stage that I find this irrelevant because hiding behind lawfare and sort of what's legal would be no different than something as a progressive you would probably be outraged about, which is if you see some very wealthy person, like let's say a wealthy person comes in and buys a city block of poor housing and wants to kick everyone out, and he knows how to use the legal system and has the money to do it. And so he could jump through those hoops where even if he's morally wrong, he's going to be able to win those cases. I don't care that a bunch of globalists and a bunch of bureaucrats that for years have destroyed this country and want illegal immigration are now crying, no, 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 no. For all of these reasons, we can never kick out any of these people, including people that
I mean,
come from
I
Mexico.
just want to be
So I
clear.
don't
Do
care
you
about that.
think that Kilmar Abrego Garcia deserved due process before being sent to El Salvador?
I think that my standard would be this. Was he an illegal? Yes. Was he from the country of El Salvador? Yes. There's your due process.
Sure.
Goodbye.
Fifth Amendment says that all people get due process. not
Define
just
due
citizens,
process.
having your day in court in colloquial terms, that's what it typically means.
Okay.
Especially if you're getting deported, there's a typical process for deportations when it comes to like hearings
Would
to get
you
these people deported.
would you admit that? So then, real quick, would you admit that the majority of people that are will not say you, but the majority of people that are criticizing this are Democrats that would have voted for people like Joe Biden, Barack Obama, etc.
Sure.
Okay. Now, you've already admitted that he was an illegal. Would you admit that the legal protections of an illegal are a lower standard than an American citizen? So, for example,
Yeah, probably. That makes intuitive sense to me. Sure.
But by the way, I'm not saying this to be rude or anything. Are you from America?
Yeah, I was born in Michigan.
So, like me and yours, free speech rights are going to be different. We could burn an American flag and say death to America. Arguably, an illegal, we would say deport that person saying that. We don't have to get into that point now, but you see what I'm saying? The standard for the protections.
I would take issue on the free speech thing, but I will agree with you. There's probably some difference in how you legally treat someone who's a citizen versus someone who's undocumented. Sure.
Last thing I'll say is, would it have been worse if Trump would have just ordered Garcia executed without a trial?
Yeah.
Well, Barack Obama ordered the execution of an
Anwar
American
al-Awlaki,
citizen.
yeah, I oppose that. I think that was really bad.
Okay, but all the Democrats, which you already admitted, that are now screaming bloody murder, including judges like Boasberg, they didn't say shit then. And in
Most
America, let me
progressives
finish
are
in case
very
the audience-
critical
let
of
me
foreign
finish.
policy from both parties as it pertains especially to drone strikes.
So let me finish just in case the audience doesn't know. Barack Obama
Sure.
ordered the execution of an American citizen, claiming that he was from a terrorist group, and then carried out that execution. And all of these Democrats that are saying, oh my God, Trump is going to be so destructive. It's so bad for our country. He's such a unique threat
Hold on.
because he's anti-constitutionalist. My question is, how can you say this is worse off for the country if Trump is just continuing the status quo that we saw from the Democrat
do you
hero
agree
who did
with
much
the
worse?
distinction that when it comes to the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki, I think that was his name, that there was no court order telling Obama, you can't do this. I think he consulted White House lawyers. I will still agree with you that I think that was wrong, and there should have been more legal pressure on him in terms of violating due process, because I don't think foreign policy is a blanket protection to violate anyone's rights as long as they're not on U.S. soil, which is the argument that Trump is now making. But again, the issue with what Trump did isn't just that he, violated due process, it's that he did it in defiance of James Boasberg's
that's not
order.
true. The due process, the level of this is worse in every way. The level's worse because it was an American citizen with Al-Awlaki. It's worse because it ordered his death, which means that there's no possible repercussions. And it's worse because all of the people that are screaming about civil rights and due process right now didn't do anything.
Didn't end up
Now,
having
so
standing.
when you're saying, oh, but Trump had this order that he violated. No, I'm sorry. A judge not even putting it in writing, but having an emergency hearing and then verbally saying, turn the plane around. It's arguable.
In his contempt document, he says that some of the flights took off after the written order as well, not just the oral order. No, the flights to El Salvador in general.
I don't know that if some took off, nonetheless, here's the point
James
that
Boasberg released. There's like a PDF online explaining
here's the point that I'm trying to make, right? Like, The idea that he tells these people while the planes are in flight or while they're getting ready to take off, he has this emergency hearing, which, by the way, the Supreme Court ruled that he had no jurisdiction to do, which the Trump administration
That has
knew.
no bearing on contempt
It does
of
have,
court, though. You understand
well,
that.
you could say that, but what it does have a bearing on is that the Trump administration knew that ultimately this guy didn't have a say in it. And what it was an activist judge who, by the way, somehow, luckily, even though it's supposed to be random draw, this same judge keeps getting all of these cases. Luckily,
Isn't
he's
this
an
the same
activist.
judge that
He's
said
an
that Trump did not have to release his tax returns?
I mean, if you give
and
me
that
a
Hillary
chance,
had to release her emails?
we could do this. We could every 20 seconds. I can interrupt you too as well. If
Sure,
that's how
I'd
you want to
rather
do it,
have like a more
that's no
dynamic
problem.
back and forth.
Okay,
but like,
that's fine. Then we'll do that. Yeah, maybe he said something about taxes. I don't care. It's the same judge that keeps getting all these cases, that keeps making these activist rulings. The idea that you're going to somehow say it's worse, that this guy, while planes were in the air, said turn them around and Trump didn't, that's somehow worse and more of a violation of due process and constitutional principles than Barack Obama, which Democrats cheered for, ordering the execution of American citizens is ludicrous.
Well, I think rule of law plays a big role here.
Well,
You
just
can
because you say,
mistakenly-
wait, just because you say rule of law there, right, well, you acknowledge that Obama violated rule of law and Democrats were all for it.
When I say rule of law, did Obama defy a court telling him that he couldn't do this or that he broke the law?
It doesn't matter. Why is
afterwards?
defying the court? So you're telling me that if Trump would have just executed Garcia without a court saying, you'd say, oh, that's not that bad. That's okay. It's
was
not
on
like a
US
court told
soil?
him not to do that.
Well, if he consulted White House lawyers, like when Obama did this to Al-Awlaki, there was some allegation that he was involved in terrorist activity. I still don't think that's sufficient to do a drone strike on an American citizen. So I'm not defending that position. I'm drawing a distinction between two cases where constitutional principles were violated, but in one case, the violation is a lot more explicit in defiance of rule of law because a judge actually got involved. Whereas in the other case, Obama thought what he was doing was legal. Do I agree with that? No.
You have
But
no
in
proof
terms
that he
of our
thought
legal
when he was-
process, I'm pretty sure the ACLU or one of Al-Awlaki's cousins tried to bring a case. There was no standing there. So like,
Okay,
these
so
are
I'll
really
just interrupt
apples
since that's what we're
comparison.
doing. We prefer back and forth, so I'll interrupt. Yeah, this
Sure.
is an absurd argument. So the argument that just because we didn't have activist judges that were jumping in and saying, no, you can't do that when it came to Obama, so we have to assume he had good motivations and thought that he could legally do it is absurd. I guarantee you, if this would have went the other way and Trump would have ordered the execution of Garcia, you wouldn't be on here saying, well, hey, at least he just didn't deport him and then a judge say to turn the plane around mid-flight, because that would have been really horrible.
You would agree there's a distinction between a drone strike on foreign soil and like executing a U.S. citizen, or not U.S. citizen, but like someone who's in the U.S. on U.S. soil, right? There's like some distinction there.
There's some distinction, and yet the distinction between deporting someone to their country of origin that had a deportation order and not turning the plane around because an activist judge that didn't have standing, that's
judge,
degrees
again,
worse of a constitutional violation than ordering the
I just want to
execution
be
of an
clear.
American
Like
citizen.
I keep seeing this trend where anytime a judge goes against Trump, they magically are now labeled an activist judge. Like, to be clear, James Boasberg was first appointed by George Bush. No fan of George Bush, then promoted by Barack Obama. This was the same judge who ordered Hillary Clinton to release her emails and defended Trump from having to release his tax returns when Trump was sued to release his tax returns. So he's made rulings that are in favor of more of like the right-wing sphere. So calling him like activist just because he issued a ruling that you don't like feels a little bit dishonest.
He's activist. You could disagree with my opinion on it, but my opinion on whether or not he's activist does nothing to unsubstantiate the argument that I made.
It's meant to take away credibility from his ruling, though.
It's meant to take away credibility in my eyes, right? But you could say, no, I think he's the best judge in the world. Clearly, the Supreme Court
He's the best
disagrees.
judge, but I think he's
fine. But
qualified to make
everywhere
these
in between,
decisions.
he's an activist person who's using his station as political, as we see many of these judges do, or he's a really great judge, or anywhere in between that.
Sure.
Point is, he didn't have standing, and by any objective measure, what Obama did to Al-Awlaki was far worse. And so if we're going to say that one of the reasons that Trump is bad, and that we have to say that his administration is bad because he's a threat to a constitutional order, what he did is a less violation of the Constitution than what Barack Obama did. And almost every single person that's screaming about Trump's constitutional violations were completely fine with what Obama did.
I want to test this logic. So let's say we have two situations, one in which a president violates the Constitution, but they believe they're acting legally and there's no legal process condemning them for that or trying to punish them for that. Another case where a president defies the judicial branch and does a similar violation of constitutional principles. Is there no difference there to you? And again, we have checks and balances for a reason. And again, like you're saying that the Supreme Court ruled that James Boasberg didn't have jurisdiction here. That is true, but that's not how these things work. When a judge issues an order, whether or not the order is later found to be improper, there's still rule of law. You still have to obey that order, and Trump did not do that.
So you asked me if there's a difference in this hypothetical that doesn't accurately represent what we talk. Yes, there is a difference in that. So
Sure.
if
Well,
in
what is
one
the-
case,
what is the issue
what
with my
you asked
hypothetical?
is, in one case you say if someone does something they think's legal versus if someone does something that a judge expressly told them they can't, is the second worse than the first. Yes. Now let
Yeah.
me ask you some questions. Yes, no, only, please. The same sort of
Okay.
questions you asked me. If a president orders someone be deported that's an illegal, is that worse than ordering they be executed? Yes or no? Which one's worse?
No.
Okay, the execution's worse. Next,
Yeah.
if a president orders some sort of harsh punishment without due process to an American citizen, is that worse than ordering that sort of harsh punishment to an illegal?
Wait, say that again. Sorry.
If a president orders some sort of harsh punishment, deportation, execution to an American citizen without due process, is that worse than him doing it to an illegal?
From a constitutional perspective, I mean, they both would equally violate the Fifth Amendment.
That's
in that case.
outrageous. So if that's the case, then
The Fifth Amendment says all persons, not all citizens, not all visa people. Like
it's an outrage, right? Because American citizens are offered stronger protections. There is legal arguments as to whether all of the protections, for example, in our Bill of Rights apply.
Uses the word citizen in some cases, like having the right to vote and other things, running for president. There's other cases where it does not use the word citizen.
So just to be clear, that would mean that anytime the United States, like military, bombs someone and it kills a civilian, right? That's murder. That those people, that they had the rights and protection that any American citizen would have of due process.
You're
so ordering the
American
execution of
citizen is caught in, like-
Al-Awlaki is the same as ordering the execution of Soleimani.
Hold on. I just want to be clear. You're saying that if the U.S. carries out a military strike in a different country where there's collateral damage of a U.S.
Correct.
citizen?
No,
and
no
what
U.S.
is-
It doesn't matter if there's a U.S. citizen. All people have equal rights under the United States Constitution, according to
People
you.
that are on under U.S. jurisdiction, like on U.S. soil.
No. Wait. So
Our
where does it?
Constitution doesn't
Okay,
apply to
real
people
quick.
living in
So
like, Yemen or
So
something.
the Fifth Amendment says people. It doesn't say people living in the jurisdiction of the United States.
What's the Constitution of the United States?
Correct.
Right?
And so therefore, when it's talking about the protections offered, therefore, it's clearly that there's a higher standard for people that are citizens of this country than elsewise. That's why, for example, that's why the INA, and I could,
in some cases, go ahead, yeah.
That's why, for example, the INA says that we could deport people not because they've committed crimes, right? So, for example, with free speech, me and you have the right, if we wanted to say, yay, Hamas, death to America. We could say that. We wouldn't legally be allowed to go sent to jail for that because the First Amendment protects us. However, those same protections aren't afforded to someone who's an illegal or to someone who is here legally as a visitor, like a student visa. There is no law that says that you can't deport them. The INA says that you're able to deport them for things such as anti-American beliefs or rhetoric, and I don't have the specifics in front of me, but there's all sorts of things that you would never be able to do to an American citizen. You would acknowledge that you can't deport an American citizen for saying death to America, right?
Yeah, Trump has opened up the door to do something like that, but we can get to that in a second. But again, like you would agree that the Constitution in some cases specifically uses the word citizen when referring to things.
That's true.
In other cases, it uses the word people. And I believe in the First Amendment, it just says that the government cannot abridge or prevent the exercise of certain rights. There's not even really a subject specified in that. And again, you're saying like, what about someone in another country? I think obviously the Constitution applies to people that are under U.S. jurisdiction because it has to do with how U.S. government conducts itself in regards to
But
those
even
people.
still, like the way that our legal system plays out, you can see that this isn't how it's applied in every day. For example, are you aware of like FISA court?
Yeah, this for like wiretapping. and
Okay,
stuff.
so for example, right, one of the reasons that the sort of corruption against Trump was so bad was they got FISA warrants against Trump's team, Carter Page, a U.S. citizen, right? One of the arguments that people made was you don't need to get FISA warrants for people that are foreign nationals. Now, if someone say that we want to spy on, Leslie Smith, who's a Russian national, and she's in the United States legally doing business, she has a green card, etc., but she's a citizen of Russia. You would say that the United States government would not be allowed to spy on her because while she's on U.S. soil, even though she's a Russian national, we're not allowed to spy on her because she's.
I do have a lot of issues with the surveillance state. So, I mean, this is an issue where, like, I'd say the government has done like a lot of overreach, especially after 9/11.
Okay, I would agree. I would agree with that. But if it was as simple as you said, is hey, the language clearly doesn't say citizens; it says people,
sure.
and that would be open.
As I was saying earlier, you kind of
yeah,
cut me off earlier. There's obviously case law here, where in some specific cases, like for example, I believe if you cross the border illegally and they catch you within 100 miles, you can be deported without a day in court. So there's case law here in terms of situations, because no right is absolute. I agree with you on that. The court always is going to draw some distinction, some line where it's like, okay, at this point, we have to make distinctions. We have to have different treatment for different statuses. But again, like, this is getting so far away from the initial point of Kilmar Abrego Garcia and Fifth Amendment rights, where again, the issue that I have here is, and tell me where you disagree with this hypothetical. What would prevent someone like Trump from snatching up me, a U.S. citizen, and just quickly getting me to CCOT before a judge finds out? The judge says, hey, you have to bring him back. He says, sorry, this is now foreign policy. You have no jurisdiction over this. What prevents that from happening?
You're an American citizen that's not from El Salvador.
Sure, but Trump's argument here is that you cannot compel me in how to conduct foreign affairs, and
That's true.
Negotiating the release of this person, whether
That's true.
the citizen, makes no difference.
So so we've already established that there's nothing worse. That actually things were worse under previous Democratic administration, and those that are screaming the loudest were perfectly fine with that. Now let's talk about the specifics of right, like ordering the execution of an American citizen with no due process is horribly worse for.
I think that execution is much more of a gray area, where I would still agree with you it was a violation of due process. So I'm not saying I disagree, but that's a lot more complicated, and there's a lot more case law that goes into that, because again, the intersection of foreign policy and jurisprudence is a complicated area. What I'm bringing up to you is that Trump is using this same type of argument, though we both agree you agree that Anwar al-Awlaki should not have been killed, right?
Correct. Well,
okay,
yes. Yeah. I think that they should have attempted to have sort of a hearing ad like absentia. So someone like they should have had some sort of hearing. Another thing,
a good faith effort should have been made to give him some kind of due process.
An area of agreement maybe we have was, I always thought that a lot of the terrorists that we kept right in these facilities, like in Guantanamo Bay, I have no problem with having a harsher standard at foreign nationals that we're accusing of terrorists. Maybe they have a military trial as opposed to a jury of peers. But I think it's absurd to just lock these people away for 10 years and say, like, hey, we're never even going to have a trial at all. So but this is what I'm saying. Like, what you're putting is a unique threat to Donald Trump. In many ways, it's just continuing the status quo. The only difference is no one cared when it was enemies of the bureaucratic state. They said, whatever, screw their rights. We don't care. But now these people that are most likely an MS-13 member that is one of these illegals that were brought in by all these bureaucracies. It's not that all of a sudden these bureaucracies that were fine with al-Awlaki, that were fine with Guantanamo Bay, that they've grown a heart and now they care about due process. It's because that they know how to use the system to get the desired outcomes.
Knowing that you're violating the law makes a difference in your culpability in violating it?
No, I don't in this unique situation, because I think that in knowing the law, they would have disagreed with that judgment and thought it was clear that there was no jurisdiction and they already had planes in the air and weren't obligated to turn them around.
The sort of point that I'm making is, my assumption is, and tell me if you disagree, that if a court had intervened and somehow told Obama you can't do this drone strike, I don't think Obama would have done it. And I think that when there's willful defiance of the law, we're talking about an entire different order of magnitude in terms of the threat that represents to our constitutional republic.
I would say that actually the opposite is true. The fact that Obama did this and no judge spoke up shows how far afoul we've ran of constitutional principles.
A judge can't just speak up in a vacuum. Someone would have to bring a case with standing.
People tried. The ACLU and others did, and they said there was no standing. So in other words, to execute an American citizen without any due process whatsoever, well, he's dead, so there's no one left. Well, his son's alive. Oh, they killed him like 2 weeks later.
I'm pretty sure the current case law allows for what happened there.
I'm sorry, I don't believe it. Now, if we could talk specifically about Garcia and the issue we're talking here, right? Like, so the idea that, let's not get it twisted, he was most likely MS-13. That's sort of irrelevant to my calculus. He was an El Salvadorian national. He did come in 2011. He was here for years. He never claimed asylum. He never claimed that he was fearful to go back until he was picked up. Then once he tried to claim asylum and that fell, only then did he say, I feel threatened to go back to El Salvador. His claim was, just real quick, and you can intervene if you think I'm wrong on any of these facts. He came in 2011. His claim is when he was 16 in 2011, he felt from a rival gang, which is interesting language. A rival gang was threatening there, something to do with like a small business that his family
owns. Made like pupusas or something. It's like a dish over there.
So what are the chances now in 2025, some 14 years later, that this gang, which have been largely wiped out, by the way, thanks to Bukele, because once more, everyone wants to call them authoritarian, but no one gave a shit about El Salvador when they were a murder capital, right? But now you care, now that the people are safe. Now people care and want to intervene. How dare you make your country safe? What are the chances that that same small gang is operating, that he has to remain fearful of them?
Okay, so I just want to go through because there's some things that are just not factually accurate. When you say he was most likely an MS-13, the judge that granted him the withholding from removal called into question this allegation from, I think, one informant, because the informant said he was a member of a gang in New York where he has never lived on record. So unless MS-13 does like Zoom calls for drive-by shootings, they have remote work now. That doesn't make much sense to me.
If I may jump in, that's because, and you, this is new information. I'm willing. Look, I think we could both agree this is a story that's ongoing, so facts change.
Sure.
Right? I'm reading, and you can tell me if you disagree. I saw Will Chamberlain was posting this today, that the reason that the judge said that was the lawyer made that claim, which went uncontested, that the particular gang of MS-13 that he was in operated only in New York, but actually evidence says that's not true, and that was one of the 5 biggest MS-13 gangs in the DC area where he lived.
My understanding is the allegation was that he was part of the New York chapter of the MS-13 gang. Again, I don't have the court document on hand right now, so I guess people that are watching can go look that up. But the point that I want to make is, again, you say he didn't get asylum, but again, getting a withholding from removal order is actually a much higher standard than getting asylum. And a judge has to adjudicate that you don't represent some kind of threat. He was checking in with ICE every single year. He had work permits. So like, this is someone who is following the rules. I agree. It's weird that he from 2011 to 2019 did not seek these statuses. I agree with that. But again, when a judge makes that determination, the standard of evidence is actually much higher than for asylum.
I think that the threat that is posed by this rationale that would basically say that some 15 million people that we should deport, that every one of them needs to be given a trial if they utter the words, "I don't feel safe in my country."
Most of them will lose their case.
They may lose, but how long would it be due process to give them to prepare for their case?
Well, it's going to take longer now that Trump is like firing immigration judges in mass.
Okay,
right?
let's say that he hadn't. Then how long would it have taken?
We'd still need to hire a lot more because we have like a backlog of 3 million cases.
So it'd be years and years and years if we had 15 million more cases that were added on top of that.
Well, it depends. Some people, you have to first have an even credible fear to go to a case in the first place. I think that was something that was in the bipartisan border bill that would have actually raised the standard to even get a hearing in the first place and would give immigration officers more authority to turn you back without necessarily having due process. But like, I agree that like there's a big issue with people waiting years and years to see a judge. And then in the meantime, there's overcrowding in cities like New York. That's a valid concern. Part of the reason why Trump won. But the way you address that is, again, by hiring a lot more immigration judges and doing an overhaul of the system. Now, you might think, do we want to give these 15 million people status? Well, my understanding is 70% of asylum cases are rejected. So we're talking about a much smaller number that actually get to stay here after they get their day in court.
Yeah, but it will take forever for them to get the day in court. And
you hire enough judges.
I don't even think like, so what do we quadruple the amount of judges? Quintuple? Where are we getting them from?
I mean, there's probably going to be some kind of analysis you can do to get the exact number. I would know the exact number, but firing them is probably moving in the wrong direction, right?
I think that the ICE judges that allowed the invasion to occur, we probably don't need them as well. How many have Trump fired, by the way?
I don't know the number off the top of my head. There's articles about this online. I think in Texas, he laid off 12 different judges. And again, even laying off a couple at a point when we have a backlog of 3 million cases, it's like, why are we moving in that direction at all?
I would have to see the evidence. I can't take it at face value that he's firing.
Would you agree that we should hire more immigration judges as a broad rule?
No, I think that a broad rule, what we should do is Congress should pass a law that says that we accept 0 asylum claims, and everyone that's made any sort of asylum claim, or I'm afraid to go back to my country,
Congress
should be immediately removed.
At least there, I would say rule of law wise, sure, Congress passed a law. Fair enough. I disagree politically, but at least there's some process being followed. That's not what's happening right now, though. That's the issue.
So I just want to make it clear, like it's not like this guy was just some family man that came here that was fearful that did everything right. Like there's a lot of things about this particular case. And again, like just before we get to the final part on this, I just want to stress this point. He had a deportation order that was never revoked.
Well,
just quickly, guys, I want to wrap this up and then want to move on to tariffs after this, if possible.
Sure.
So last points on this, and then we'll move on to that.
So then, if I could
my one core
I have one more
issue
point I want to get to on this as well. Yeah.
Sure. My one core issue here with all of this is that my main issue with Kilmar Abreu Garcia being deported and those other 200 something people that were sent to El Salvador is there is zero limiting principle that would prevent the Trump administration from doing this exact same thing to citizens. He's already talking about sending our homegrowns to El Salvador, which I hope you would agree is fucking insane. But even if that's not the case, what Trump is doing here is saying, As long as I get you off of U.S. soil before a court finds out, it falls under the blanket term of foreign policy, and then you have no more rights anymore.
Okay, so I think I've made my point that this was a person that should have been deported, and I think that if we delved into it deeper, we'd find out that you would be against deporting him to another country as well, and that you would probably also, and even if you wouldn't, this is going to be the overarching Democrat
Can you
argument.
address my issue here?
Yes, I'm getting to that, but this was the final point I wanted to make. Then I'll address your issue, right? And then I think you'd also see that they'll make this claim about El Salvador, Venezuela, and a lot of other countries where we have these alleged gang members coming from, that actually those countries aren't safe anyways. So all of these people have a credible fear, and so they're going to hold this out. And so the worst people that we want to deport are going to be held here the actual longest, because we'll say, oh, you can't send them back to their country because they're.
I think we should probably raise the standard for asylum, but that's a separate conversation.
Okay, now to your point specifically, it's interesting because you talk about separation of power, rule of law, and things like that. Actually, the criticism you have where sort of, well, Trump, this judge said that Trump must facilitate their return, and he's claiming that that's foreign policy. Yeah, that's actually absolutely true. Like, let's say, do you think the court had the power to tell Trump, you must do everything to bring him back? Should we go to war with El Salvador?
No, I think there's reasonable limitations, because I'm not disputing that there's some foreign policy overlap here. But again, Trump is paying Bukele to hold these people.
Did he
could just make a phone call. He could just make a phone call and say, hey, can you let this guy out? And he'd let him out.
I don't know that that's true. He's a citizen of El Salvador.
Trump is paying them to hold these people, though.
Show me the check he sent to hold Garcia.
I don't have the check with me, but a Democrat senator just went to El Salvador and spoke to the vice president, and the vice president of Bukele said the reason we're holding these people is because the Trump administration is paying us to do so.
It's hearsay from someone that has a political axe to grind anyways. It may or may not be true.
I
don't care. It is a citizen. It is a citizen of El Salvador. Once they're in
for granted for a second, and maybe you can fact check me later, just take for granted that Trump is paying them to hold these people.
He's paying them to hold members of the gang Trey Dargawa. I don't know that he paid. You tell me, isn't this what happened? This person was never accused of being in that gang. They were sending these people from the Alien Enemies Act, from the Trans Dargawa gang, to El Salvador. They were paying for those. They had an extra seat. They saw, oh, this is an illegal from El Salvador that's alleged to be an MS-13 member. We'll send him. I'm not sure.
It was an administrative error, right?
Yes, I'm not sure that this person was deported under the Alien Enemy Act. Was he?
My understanding is that he was, because he was on those same flights that were sent to El Salvador that James Boasberg ruled on. That's my understanding.
Okay, I don't know that that's true, but if that's the case, that sort of changes the calculus of our conversation, because at that point, if you could make the argument, and I know you disagree with the overarching theme of this, but if you make the argument that MS-13 is sort of a hostile foreign gang that was sent by a foreign country, then any sort of revocation of deportation order would be revoked. For example, if you have, I forget what the exact term is, I think you used it. The order he had that said you can't be deported back to
withholding of removal,
withholding of removal, that's automatically revoked if it's ruled that you're a terrorist or in some sort of criminal gang.
The order is granted based on a risk assessment as well.
But it doesn't matter if we say that Trump legally applied the Alien Enemy Act and he's allowed to declare who is that. That's a separate issue.
Sure, but also a judge has to decide whether he's legally even invoking that act or not, right?
Well, okay, but then who's Boasberg to argue to turn the plane around before that's been adjudicated?
He's just saying pause it for 14 days so we can adjudicate it, because in some cases there's irreparable harm here. Sometimes when you're trying to pause an action from the government, when a court does that, it's because if you don't pause it, there's going to be irreparable harm. As we're now seeing, they're saying, well, too late. He's in CCOT now. Can't get him back.
I think that I've made my case clear. I'm willing to move on. This person,
I'm sorry, just real quick. What would prevent this from happening to a U.S. citizen?
Because you're a U.S. citizen, so you can't be deported to this
but
country. It'd be easy for you to prove
quickly before a judge finds out, and then they say, well, it's foreign policy now. He's out of the country. What prevents that?
Because you would be able to prove that you're an American citizen. Question for you. I answered.
But a court would
what's to prevent the president from ordering your execution as an American citizen?
The courts?
Did it work for Alawaki?
No, because again, this is the overlap of foreign policy. You're making my point.
No, I'm not. The point I'm trying to make is your criticism was already the status quo. You're saying if we allow a president without due process to
override constitutional rights, it's very dangerous.
Your argument you're making is if we allow a president to take a harsh penalty on someone that would get them off the soil of the United States so they couldn't defend themselves without due process, what's to stop them from doing that to you? Well, if we allowed a president to execute an American citizen without due process, what's to stop them from doing that to you?
Because, again, this goes back to the distinction between a drone strike and a deportation without due process.
Drone strike's worse.
All right, fellas, never a good time to move on. But Rob, the people have spoken. They want to hear you pronounce the gang, the TVA gang again.
Sure. It reminds me of that scene from Office Space, right? Where the Samir, he's like, Samir, Mir, not going to work here anymore. Like I said, I don't give a shit how to pronounce these violent gangsters. Get them out of our country. If you are somehow allowed to stay, learn to speak the language and start giving your same names like Bob and Jim and Jake. Shit like that. We're tired of all these garbage names. Just call them heathen terrorists that they are.
Is Bob like a top tier name for you?
What's that? Bob?
Is Bob a top tier
I hate
name?
being called. Well, I don't hate. I don't like being called Bob, but I like normal names. Like I like my gangs called Bloods and Crips. That I could pronounce. So
okay.
I'm thinking about doing a public shaming ritual with Andrew Wilson at some stage. Maybe next time we have a show where I get him to pronounce a lot of different Latin people's names because he's so bad at pronouncing Latin names, but it is always interesting. So we do want to move on to tariffs, fellas. At some point, maybe as well, I don't know how you guys feel about this, but I wouldn't mind covering also the whole like anti-Semitism bills and laws that are being sort of pushed through as well. See what you guys think about that. But yeah, so if we could move on to tariffs now, maybe Rob, you could open it up with this one.
Yeah, so I'll be honest, I think some of the way the tariffs are being suggested go too far, right? But there could be a rhyme or reason to that. The first thing to say about this tariff argument is no matter what me or Adam say here or how articulate we become, neither of us know the outcome. One of the things that happens when you're talking early into an administration is oftentimes people want to make broad proclamations or guesses on what will happen when it comes to economics, and then it's very difficult to know if that's going to come to fruition. For example, there were people saying that Biden's infrastructure bill in 2021 or 2022 was going to be amazing. It was going to do all this good, rural broadband, blah, blah, blah. All of this sounded good. Well, we know how that went. No one was connected to the rural broadband despite $47 billion spent to it, etc. So it's difficult to make declarative statements about whether or not this will end up. So one of us might look like a fool. If I say the tariffs are great and Adam says they're terrible, 3 years from now, we could go back and look at this and see who was more right. I think that in a principle, I would prefer more of a free trade world with some sort of protectionist barriers for each country, like limited though. Don't want anything super crazy. However, I think that the reason that I applaud Trump's and his efforts, even if they're not successful, is the status quo is not sustainable. We rely on China for so much now of our general manufacturing and general way of life, such as steel, such as ammunition, if we ever go to war with China, such as production of simple pharmaceuticals like antibiotics. We rely on China for all of this. The wealth disparity in the United States has been ballooning. The manufacturing in this country from people that I have the most affinity for, blue collar workers in rural America, has been screwed. They were given a false bill of hope that, trust us, if we hollow out manufacturing, you guys are going to get awesome jobs in other areas. And instead, what we get is inflation and importation of illegals and others that do jobs. If you look at all the job reports under Biden, you can see that almost all of these jobs were going to foreign-born people. And the people that live in this country are getting worse and worse off as they're being shamed as they're somehow part of the problem. So at least Trump's trying to have a strategy that will, one, either result in countries coming back because they'll be fearful that tariffs mean that they can't have access to the U.S. market unless they build here, or second, and what I think's actually going on, is that he's trying to get better negotiated deals, particularly with our allies, but other countries, to have better deals so that their tariff rates are lowered and their other trade blocks are lowered, and to hopefully encircle China to encourage them to be more in a relationship with the United States going forward than with China. There's a third area of discussion we could get to, Adam, that's more complicated that I'll admit I'm not the best to have, but I can fumble through it if you like, that has to do with, I think there's a possibility that Trump's trying to get us off the U.S. as the world reserve currency and get us back to more of a gold standard. And there's a solid argument to be had that tariffs are the first step in encouraging a purchase of gold, which we now see gold flowing into the United States to have that sort of currency back, which will stop the sort of massive debt spiral that we're in. None of it's sustainable, though. Would you agree with that at least, Adam, that the status quo is not sustainable?
Economically, broadly speaking, sure, but that can mean very different things to different people. So again, I think when you want to overturn the status quo, the question is what you're doing actually better than the status quo, because it can be worse, even if the status quo is bad. Just real quick point, you said on the Biden infrastructure bill, the issue with that infrastructure bill is that they're being really slow at spending the money. Not that they've spent it and nothing's happened. It's just that these states sometimes have to jump through so many hoops to get the funds to even start building. That's an issue.
Thank God Trump's rolling back regulations as well.
If it's building regulation, I'll give him credit for that. I don't know what specific regulations he's doing, but zoning laws are fucked in this country in pretty much every state, except like some red states actually that do build more stuff. So when we talk about tariffs, again, my main issue with these tariffs is, number one, and I want to ask you, Rob, because I always get a different answer to this question. In your mind, are these tariffs a means to an end, or are they the end goal in and of themselves?
I think they're a means to an end. And I think you have a valid criticism of there. That seems like Trump speaks out of both sides of his mouth, or his team does. But let me ask you a question, like to counter this, right? If let's take for a second, operate under the assumption this is just a means to an end and it's trying to get negotiating. Would you admit that it would be a weaker negotiating strategy to be like, we're not really serious about them?
Yeah, probably, sure.
So I think that if it is a negotiating tactic, this is exactly how Trump would want it to play out. He wants people like Navarro out there saying, no, the end goal is tariffs. The end goal is to have zero trade deficit.
Sure.
And then he wants Scott Bessent out there saying
that the tariff threats come off as very credible now when people have seen like, oh shit, if bond yields start to go up, Trump's going to freak out and just pause them. So like, if anything, like when he faces sufficient pressure, now there's a pause on the tariffs. And the funniest thing about that was, what's her name? Carolyn Levitt was saying, I clearly didn't read The Art of the Deal. This was always part of the plan. And then Trump is a thing 10 minutes later saying like, yeah, I did this because people were getting scared and I wanted to calm their fears a little bit. So it's funny how there's like so much chaos and even the messaging on these tariffs. You bring up China. I think it's valid to say China is probably geopolitically our biggest adversary. There does need to be trade policy that takes that into account. The issue that Trump has had here, though, is, again, China also relies on us for things like airplane parts. Like, they also rely on us to buy from them. So, like, this idea that they have all the leverage over us isn't true. There's a give and take there. And if you want to use things like industrial policy to fight China, you're better off using subsidies than tariffs. This is what China does. People talk about China dumping their products. One of the ways that China does that is they subsidize the fuck out of their manufacturing, and then they sell it in global markets for below break even, and they just outcompete everyone else's industry. And what tariffs are meant to do against China is say, okay, we have a more expensive US alternative and a cheaper import. Let's make the cheaper import just as expensive as the more costly US alternative. My response is, why not just make the US alternative cheaper than the import? You lower prices, revitalize manufacturing, and then also American products become more competitive on the world stage as well. When you talk about using tariffs as a negotiating tool, my issue here is negotiating to do what? Because some of these tariffs were applied on Australia and the United Kingdom. We have a trade surplus with these countries. So if the goal is like, we're doing these tariffs, so you guys buy more from us, then why did he impose them on countries that are ostensibly doing what he wants them to be doing? And again, like the formula he used to calculate the reciprocal tariffs was like, I've studied economics. It's not a real formula. He divided like our trade deficit by the volume of imports or something, which is like, that's not how you calculate tariffs or anything else. And then he cut that in half and said, we're being kind. A lot of these countries, the supposed rate they're charging us on that little infographic from the White House is completely fabricated. And then again, it's like, if you want to use tariffs against China, there's a place for that. I think we already have. Biden raised tariffs on their electric vehicles. That's why they don't sell any electric cars in the US. And Trump now has pretty much just cut off our entire China supply chain by raising it again to like 245%, which means effectively you can't even import anything from China at this point. You're better off going to Vietnam or India or something else.
So three areas to get to. One, you've conceded that the status quo is not sustainable. I will concede that that doesn't mean that any change is good. One thing that there's a misnomer, like, sometimes people think that this is the worst things could ever get. That's not true. World history will tell you things could get much worse very fast.
We're not in a recession or depression, yeah.
Well, arguably we've been in a recession for a while under Biden, and they were manipulating the data. Nonetheless, that's not even what I'm talking about. There are things far worse than a recession, which I'm sure you would agree. But I think that if we realize that the status quo is not sustainable, and we're asking ourselves whether or not Trump's administration is a success, at least he is doing something that has a chance to improve us from the status quo. There is zero chance that a Kamala Harris presidency would have done that. It would have been a continuation of the puppets that were running the human vegetable Joe Biden, now running Kamala Harris, who's never taken a stance.
Do you support the CHIPS Act? I'm curious. Do you support the CHIPS Act or no? I'm curious.
I don't think it did as much as people said. In theory, I'm not a big fan.
Yeah, in theory, like, do you support investing in domestic manufacturing to incentivize production?
Which is in effect a subsidy.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah, I think in general, I don't have a problem if you're starting from an uneven playing field, right? Which I think we'll all agree the world is. All countries have subsidies, they have tariffs, they have other trade barriers, etc. So if you're doing that to try to sort of level a playing field, I would have to look specifically on sort of chips regulations from countries around the world. But the problem in general with what you're talking about with subsidies, right, is that it's basically in effect the similar problems I would have with tariffs in general, that I prefer a more free market strategy, except we're not starting from a clean slate. So you're trying to use these things as negotiating tactics. The difference with subsidies is it massively increases government spending, right? Which we're already
but
in a
there's a return on
spiraling
that
debt.
investment.
Well, but we're already seeing a spiraling debt. Tariffs, on the other hand, if they end up going into an effect and it's not just a bargaining tactic and we have to do them because people call our bluff, that's not increasing government debt. That's actually bringing in revenue.
Well,
Right.
that actually depends, because some of these tariffs can cause economic contraction. Some companies can't
Well-
even absorb these types of costs. And then it's a question of like, okay, do you compensate for the lost corporate tax revenue with the revenue from tariffs, which are notoriously not the best way to bring in revenue? Just like numbers wise, the best way to bring in revenue is like income taxes and payroll taxes.
So what we can see is that oftentimes, much like all the pie in the sky, if we just spend more, it'll be better. These subsidies oftentimes are used in ways that are inefficient and end up don't bring you back the return on investment.
What
that we
about
were
how
promised.
China does them?
But what about, like, arguably without these
China
sort of
is able to dump their products into our markets because they subsidize their manufacturing and sell below break even.
Okay, that may be true, right? But then that would be
Why
a
don't we
reason
play
to
that same game instead of pointing at them and crying about it?
why don't we just tariff them so that they can't do it? Why
Because
would we
that makes
subsidize?
everyone worse.
Would you
We can fight
acknowledge
China
would you
and
acknowledge-
lower consumer prices and create jobs and create
That's not
manufacturing
true. That's
with
not, that's
subsidies
not,
instead of
that's
tariffs.
not what happened. One, we oftentimes see these subsidies don't have the desired effect. See Solyndra and all these other green places that we gave all these subsidies
Depends
to.
how they're structured, sure.
So the idea, if we just do subsidies, will work. Second, the CHIPS Act specifically, many of those factories were already going to be built here before the CHIPS Act. They already had plans to build them. Third, we already see places like NVIDIA saying because of these tariffs, they're going to build new plants in Dallas. So that has nothing to do with the CHIPS Act. So we can already see the tariffs bringing chips manufacturing to the United States. Fourth, a subsidy, unlike a tariff, is in effect an unfair trade practice, if you want to look at it that way, against the entire world, not just against China. Because if we subsidize, for example, automobiles in the United States, and then we sell them to China, now we could compete, or we could compete with the Chinese vehicles being sold here. But we could also sell them to Canada and Mexico and South Africa.
How about
and
all?
UK, right? But the problem is, so then what that would result in is those countries then saying, these are unfair trade practices by the United States, therefore we're going to increase our tariffs. Whereas if you just have a tariff against China, that isn't seen as an aggressive tactic against UK, against Canada,
Well, it's seen
etc.
as an aggressive tactic by China, and then they buy less of our produce, and then Trump has to bail out the farmers like he did in his first term, because we also sell stuff to other countries. And the idea of reciprocality, I actually like. My idea would be, let's do reciprocal subsidies. Whatever sectors China is subsidizing to outcompete us in global markets, let's subsidize the exact same percentage our domestic.
Why just China? Would you do it to Europe?
Because I think with China, there's a lot more of an adversarial relationship where we probably do need to wean off of having them in our supply chains. With allied countries, I'm a lot less worried about that.
Okay, so then what about allied countries that have tariffs on products like our automobile industry?
I mean, their people are worse off because of those tariffs. They have to pay higher prices.
Well, arguably the people of China are worse off because of the subsidies in the sending to the United States. There are certainly people at the top.
They also
Anytime
pay
you
lower
have
prices for their cars over
with
there.
both tariffs and subsidies, people that end up benefiting from this are people at the top of the food chain. The average workers, they're
I would
usually
love to have strong union-paying jobs at these
nonetheless.
factories.
Well, who seems to be the party that the labor now appreciates more?
I mean, you can look at the NLRB changes under Biden, and you can say he was anti-labor, but that's not borne out by the actual changes he made. Republicans are the ones that support right-to-work laws that crush unions in many states.
Right to work is something that should exist. You shouldn't be forced to join a union if you don't like. Nonetheless, the unions, you can cite all the data you want, just like people cited the border data, the jobs data, it gets rescinded all the time. The truth is they're voting with their feet, and these unions that have been decades long, Democrats are starting to realize that actually the policies of the Democrat, the free trade, etc., hollowed out the manufacturing in the United States.
They picked up on a real problem, but that doesn't mean Trump is the solution. That's
Well,
kind of my whole. I think Trump was elected for a very real reason, which is that people want structural change to the establishment and the status quo in this country. But I think Trump kind of co-opted that and used that for his own nefarious sort of narcissistic purposes.
The nefarious part of it, that's going to be a matter of opinion. I don't think it's nefarious on Trump's point. But again, we already talked about NVIDIA building chips in Dallas. There's been several other companies that said that they're going to start manufacturing in the United States. And we haven't even, let me finish. We haven't even got to the negotiating table yet. The one area I think that's worth talking about that you talk about, and there's two things. I think your strongest point is a point of predictability, right? Because the upside of unpredictability is the rest of the world might be like, holy shit, this dude's willing to tank his own stock market. He's willing to tank his own investments in his country and the donors that invested in him because he's that pissed off about this terrorist thing. We're going to take him seriously. So when you make the point like, oh, the fact that he yielded to the bond market, no, I think that it still looks better than if he would have never done anything, because they would have just said, yeah, we're going to call his bluff, because we know if he does that, it may cost them the midterms because the stock market would decline. And the fact that Trump was willing to go through with it and see this stock market decline and say F you, and on top of that, it doesn't look like his popularity diminished all that much. I think then our allies in the West are like, holy shit, like they might be able to do this and hold out for more than 2 years. Now, I agree that the bond market thing, it maybe doesn't look the best from a negotiating tactic of Trump, but it's certainly better than the status quo was. But what I'll say when it comes to sort of like the idea of like this unpredictability, there is an argument that you're right. Businesses want predictability to invest, right? And so the upside of unpredictability means that we could get better negotiated deals. The downside is, if you're Toyota, do you want to move to the United States knowing that Pete Buttigieg could become president in 2028 and just say, you know what, I'm going to completely change the tariff structure. And now it's not as profitable in the United States because you're paying labor more than you would have in China. These are good arguments. But what I would say is the reason that I prefer Trump's strategy is because regardless of good ideas you may have, I don't think your ideas were particularly that great. But if we would, you haven't had a lot of time to flush them out, in fairness, those weren't going to be implemented in the status quo. There was zero chance that you're admitting the status quo was not sustainable, and that there is no chance Kamala Harris would have done any of this, or any other Democrat or Republican that we'd seen in the past, whether it be
Do you not think that Kamala Harris would have like tried to subsidize domestic manufacturing? I mean, she had plans to subsidize production new homes, like 3 million new homes. Like,
I
Democrats
think she would have
subsidize
continued
it.
the
That's kind of what
policies of
Democrats
Joe
do.
Biden. How did Joe Biden do with those issues in the United States?
Those bills were extremely like held down by regulation that was not
Right.
needed.
Why would it have been different under Kamala Harris?
Because
Was
I
she
think
going to
had smarter
revoke
people-
regulations?
I think she had smarter people around her. I think Biden was like a little bit too old school in that sense.
Who was different around Kamala Harris than Joe Biden?
People like Mark Cuban, like she had more of the business community around her, which I think gave her more of an insight into like the Biden administration was notorious for sort of like fully cutting off the business community, which I think is a good thing, broadly speaking. The government should be working in the favor of the average person, but you need to have some understanding of logistics and capex and factories being built. And you need to understand that, like, if you want to bring chips back to the US, some companies might do that, but without a public sector push to really incentivize factories, union paying jobs in states all over the country, especially in middle America, that does require public sector investment. And am I saying Kamala Harris is going to be perfect? Absolutely not. I have a lot of disagreements with her. But when it comes to which administration is more likely to subsidize manufacturing and production of things in the US, it's for sure Democrats.
No, I just think that, like, for any subsidization that they would add, they would have been in favor of regulations and other things that these same companies would have been appalled by. So, for example, states that you see that have done things like eliminate the state income tax, they're thriving with businesses. States like Tennessee, even in places like Pennsylvania, we had Republicans that were running, and we would have seen industry flocking to Pennsylvania if we took back some of that red tape and some of those taxation that they were putting. So the idea, what I'm saying is, I fundamentally disagree with you that Kamala Harris would have been markedly different and had markedly different people, because I don't think that Joe Biden was running his administration. And I think the very people running his administration were the ones that installed Kamala Harris in one of the most anti-democratic things we've ever seen as the de facto candidate that received 0 primary votes. So her policies would have been ran by the same people that were running Joe Biden's. By the way, the same people that were running Barack
Obama. To hold
Obama's.
the primary by the time Biden dropped out?
No, they intentionally, and which is another reason to vote for Donald Trump, which is why it's a success, because we have outed the people. Did you think, I just have a, like, you personally, not to make it too personal, but did you think Biden was cognitive declined? Were you making videos?
Yeah, I was saying Biden should drop out in like 2023. I now run
Okay,
again.
fair enough. Well, we know.
And I actually will go a step further. I think there'd be an argument to invoke, I'm forgetting which amendment it is, that the president is not capable of doing his duties.
Fair enough. But you will acknowledge that almost the entire Democratic Party, the mainstream media, all of the fundraisers, etc., like the sort of corporate interests that go, they all saw what me and you saw, because we don't have any special access, and all of them had closer access to Biden. They lied.
Yeah,
they
Biden
lied. No, wait,
definitely lied.
let me finish. They lied to the American people up until their hand was forced, because they tried to call Trump's bluff and say, we're going to have ridiculous terms for this debate between Biden and Trump. It's going to be far earlier. It's going to be set in a network that we know will be biased.
I totally agree with you on this specific point.
Okay, but then when you say, well, they didn't have time for a primary, but that was intentional. They set it up to
Biden
where
decides when he drops out, right?
But what
Like, we
I'm
can't
saying
force
is
him.
it's anti-democratic in that these people, you have it like, let's say that Biden was cognitive and then he's in a car wreck, right?
Yeah.
Then we would say, of course, they didn't have time for a primary. You'll acknowledge that's not what happened. The people that knew Biden wasn't capable, but lied to the American people for years. And then when, unfortunately for them, they were exposed on the national stage, they said, oh shit. So that's why there wasn't a primary. The Democrat, I'm not a Democrat, so I don't care. But if you're a Democrat, you did not have a voice. You did not get to pick. And the reason wasn't because some terrible ailment befallen Joe Biden. It's because the people running the Biden administration, the mainstream media, almost everyone in the political
people
class
like Ron
lied to
Klain,
you.
like Biden's very inner circle, I think, kept him shielded even from other people in the White House, to the extent that I think most Democrats were just under a false impression of what Biden's ability was. I think it was a very small group of people that actually saw consistently behind the scenes him like falling asleep and struggling to speak to other world
Then
leaders.
how did you know in 2023?
Oh, I just thought he was like not going to win re-election. That's why I wanted him to drop out.
So wait, you wanted to invoke the 25th Amendment because you thought he wouldn't win the election?
In 2023, I made a YouTube video saying he'd lose the election, but now knowing what I know, I think invoking the 25th would have made sense as well.
So you were unable to see through publicly available evidence, like in 2023, that Biden was
I thought he was slowing down a lot, but I think you'd have to admit that debate with Trump was a different order of magnitude in terms of how bad he looked. I've never seen him look that bad.
I don't think, well, he certainly looked worst there, but that was
A
because,
lot worse.
But there were things that
I watched that debate with apolitical friends of mine, and they're like, what the fuck happened? I've like never seen him do this.
But here's the point, right? Like the point is, the reason that he looked worse there was because they held him from the cameras over and over. But in the least, the little brief spirits you saw of him, like the Easter Bunny having to usher him away at the egg roll because he's so confused, or constantly, like when he's in front of world leaders, them having to usher him off the stage, it was evident to anyone watching. Furthermore, if you want to take it a step further and say, well, it was only an inner circle, well, that's not true, because the entirety of the mainstream press knew. Now they're all writing books about it. Oh, we knew in 2022. All of the fundraisers knew. They all knew, and they lied, which is another reason when I said my third and most important reason for voting for Trump, why he was a success, was because it exposed the actual least democratic, anti-constitutional scumbags that are the bureaucrats that are actually running this country. My argument for my political stance is as follows. What does it mean to be a populist to me? The irony is, as a progressive, I bet if me and you weren't debating and we just had like a conversation, we're probably going to agree on a surprising lot, because I bet, like me, you think that the current system basically screws over the average person, right? That there's a lot that goes on. We already had agreements about the Patriot Act, sort of Alawaki, things of that nature. Like
all I would say to what you just said is I think that the Republicans are way, way more corrupt than Democrats. It does not excuse the Democrats at all. But again, in an election, saying that like this corruption in the high levels of the DNC or this covering for Biden was sufficient reason to vote for someone who has an entirely different policy agenda, I don't think makes much sense.
I'm not saying that it should be a reason to vote if you disagree with this policy agenda. Clearly that. You may pick a known liar over someone who's being transparent, but you hate their policies. Of course, that's a possibility. But what I'm saying is, until we out the people that are unaccountable and really run the country and lie to the American people like this, which is against the spirit of the entire Constitution and what this project of our government's supposed to be, the only chance of doing that was through a vote of Donald Trump. And now, because he won, right, or maybe correlation as opposed to causation that he won, people don't trust these scumbags anymore. That's the large reason why the Democrats are in the hole. That's why the media is in the hole, because we were gaslit. We're gaslit about Russia collusion. We're gaslit about
Democrats are in the hole because a lot of Democratic voters think that they're extremely weak. That's like a big part of why their approval rating is so low.
That's not the
All
only
right, fellas,
reason.
I think that it's about time we moved on the topic. A few of the popular ones that the chat wants to hear about is Trump's gender policies. And then I would like to get into the anti-Semitism stuff at some point. And if we can, the global reserve currency as well.
I also want to talk about corruption real quick, because that's a point I think is important to discuss, but we can maybe.
Well, it's sort of what the first topic was, but I have no problem. I'm happy to talk about corruption. It's my favorite.
I just wanted to ask you about the Eric Adams thing. I don't know if you're familiar with what happened.
Yeah, what happened with Eric Adams is...
Let's go into that for a little bit, then we'll move into some gender
Can we
stuff.
agree 5 minutes on sort of the idea of corruption around Eric Adams?
Yep.
Sure.
Yep.
The Eric Adams thing, I think there's many reasons. We've heard over and over that it's perfectly fine for the FBI and the DOJ to selectively prosecute. For all we know, Eric Adams was cooperating with them in things they thought were policy important. We were told over and over that that's completely legitimate when we saw the two-tier justice system that protected the enemies of Donald Trump, and then engaged in taking opposition research from them and weaponizing law enforcement in ways that this country's never seen. The corruption that we saw, the fact that we're going to talk about Eric Adams as an example of corruption, while literally the FBI was illegally spying on Trump's team, knowing that the information was coming from Hillary Clinton,
Are you talking
relying
about Crossfire Hurricane?
that's part of what I'm talking about. Relying
Okay.
on a suspected Russian spy under the accusation that Trump was colluding with Russia. Meanwhile, our FBI and Hillary's team were actually colluding with Russians in order to spread disinformation
Okay.
to illegally spy on his team. Yeah, I would say that corruption's far worse than
Okay,
the Eric Adams
so
thing,
real
which is
quick
not.
on Operation Crossfire Hurricane, I believe there was an Inspector General report of the DOJ that happened under Trump where they said mistakes were made, but they were not politically motivated. And getting to Eric Adams, the issue that I have here is a Trump-appointed U.S. District Attorney, Danielle Sassoon, resigned over this. Appointed by Trump in his second term. She is a staunch conservative. I think she's in the Federalist Society. Her and Hagen Scotton, these are die-hard Trump supporters appointed by Trump as district attorneys. And she says in her resignation letter, I attended a meeting on January 31st with Mr. Beauvais, Adams' counsel, and members of my office. Adams' attorneys repeatedly urged what amounted to a quid pro quo, indicating that Adams would be in a position to assist with the department's enforcement priorities only if the indictment were dismissed. Mr. Beauvais admonished a member of my team who took notes during this meeting and directed the collection of those notes at the meeting's conclusion. This is like cartoonish levels of corruption that are so bad that a Trump supporter is resigning over this.
I don't give a shit. Trump supporters like John Bolton, Trump supporters like Jeff Sessions, these were people that were so-called Trump supporters
picked
that
by
were
Trump in his second term.
I don't care. I don't care. Just because George Bush,
on the validity
let
of
me
this
finish. Just because George Bush or Donald Trump appointed someone so they're Republican, we have to take their word at face value. That's not an argument to me because I've seen Trump. One of his weak suits is he appoints a bunch of people that are bad, right? So that's not really an argument that I take weight into. Secondly, let's say that the worst is true. Okay, so then what happened here? Trump wanted to deport illegals, so he wanted Eric Adams there. So he said, hey, we won't prosecute you if you help us deport illegals.
He wanted access to Rikers specifically.
I don't care. That pales in comparison to what the Democrats have done that are now complaining about this, that weaponize the entire legal system to go after Donald Trump, including those in New York. I don't give a shit. I'm tired of listening to people talk about these little drops and that, oh my God, this is corruption. This is corruption when they were silent or they actively participated in the blatant corruption that we saw against Trump for 8 years and Trump supporters. I don't care.
I'm guessing that all the indictments were corruption too.
What's that?
Are
you
you
want to go through them one by one? I'd be
indictments
happy.
against them?
Can we get to this debate to go through like 12 hours? We can go through all of these indictments one by one. No problem. I'd be happy to talk about each and every one of them. Is that what you want to do?
What's your issue with the classified documents case? Because that to me is the strongest one.
I think that almost every person in Washington has mishandled classified documents.
Sure. That's
okay.
not what
so
the
the
allegation of
selective,
obstruction of justice. They gave him a year to return everything.
That's not true. What they did was almost immediately, we saw Noerr, a person who was in charge of Noerr that was tweeting things like #resist. He decided on day one, oh, I wonder what's in those boxes. What happened was they decided that they were going to investigate Trump with a fine-tooth comb from the get-go. And then they had all sorts of things when Trump was reasonably allowing them in. They were like, well, you're not cooperating in this way or that way. FBI agents, you want to talk about resigning, wrote letters in private that they thought it was absurd that there was a raid on Mar-a-Lago because there was cooperation occurring. Meanwhile, we had Hillary Clinton's team, on the other hand, that not only mishandled classified documents, but then had a lawful subpoena, which they deleted, actually destroyed the evidence in an unrecoverable way. How many of them were charged with a crime?
To my understanding, none.
Oh, now which is worse?
I'm not here to defend Hillary Clinton, just to be clear. We can do the whole whataboutism thing in circles for 12 hours, like you said.
It's not whataboutism. When you ask me specifically
your description of the case is inaccurate.
That's what I'll give you a chance.
National Archives, I've read the indictment, gave Trump multiple months to return documents. He returned some. They returned some, and they said, this isn't everything. What else do you have? He stalled. They took a while before they even referred it to the DOJ, because at first it was just, hey, can you return these documents? Even then, my understanding is the DOJ gave Trump multiple opportunities to return these documents and not pursue any kind of criminal indictment. This only became a matter of obstruction of justice when there was security camera footage and text messages found of people that work for Trump saying, he said, like, hide this box over here, or like, don't show this person this, as they're actively being investigated. The reason Mar-a-Lago was raided was because Trump refused to comply with subpoenas and actually turn over these documents. And again, Trump is on tape. He is on tape, recorded, showing people these attack plans on Iran and saying verbatim, if I was still president, I could have declassified these, but I'm not president anymore, so I can't be showing you this. Like,
so
he's on tape.
Adam conveniently, I don't know if you didn't understand or you're intentionally misrepresenting. My argument is this is a crime that almost everyone commits, and there's selective prosecution, which is antithetical to the entire foundation of our legal system. Please. Yes, this is a crime that's committed all the time, and it's antithetical to sort of have selective prosecution. Please, let me finish, please.
Yeah.
I sit there, right? Okay, so that's my argument. Now, he's going to say not everyone does it. Okay, then let's talk about his contemporaries that we can see. One, we know what Hillary Clinton did was worse. The FBI decided to give everyone immunity and go as easy as possible. She literally not only mishandled classified documents, which they knew for years, and allowed her to go, and you didn't have places like Noerr or other record keeper places that were consistently demanding this information back, but when there was a lawful subpoena issued by Congress, they destroyed that evidence. Clear case of obstruction of justice. Everyone given immunity, no one charged. Selective prosecution, then that they decide to go after Trump. He then talks about things like this. He says about the cooperation. That's not true. There's stories that talk about how there were levels of cooperation. There were disagreements on specific files. But once this actually happened, the raid on Mar-a-Lago, not only did several FBI agents protest this and say they thought it was beyond the pale, but we can see the way they did this. You would think if you're raiding a president's home that you would have all of your I's dotted and your T's crossed. They were taking everything like souvenir ball bats, napkins. They're taking everything because the point was, as with every one of these stories, to go as hard as Trump. There's your person. Now find the crime. That's what they were doing. Last thing I'll say real quick. You talk about him on tape. After that procedure, it was Biden's DOJ that actually issued the orders to go after Trump. We now know that Biden himself not only committed the same crime and improperly handled classified documents, not only held it for far longer, including his time as a senator, not only was that as a senator something he would have never been allowed to take home, unlike Trump, but he actually admitted, you ready for this? On tape, this is probably classified and I'm not allowed to show it to you, but here, go ahead and read it. He literally did the exact same thing as Trump and then had his DOJ prosecute Trump. It's selective prosecution all throughout. The kind of mishandling classified information isn't that a big deal. However, the selective prosecution to try to influence politics.
The issue with the classified documents case is not just mishandling classified material. You're half right that probably every government official to some extent mishandles it. The issue is that he did not really cooperate with the government in returning them. The main charge there is obstruction of justice, not just, and the way we know this is the case.
Did Hillary's team cooperate?
Hold on. The documents that Trump returned are not part of the indictment. He wasn't actually charged for those because it turns out when you comply and return the documents, you're not going to get charged, even though he technically could have been charged for mishandling. They didn't charge him for that stuff in the areas where he complied. And I want to ask you a broader question. Is it just like any time that Trump is indicted, it's like a political witch hunt, but then anytime a Democrat, like Eric Adams was indicted, Bob Menendez, like Democrats also face legal consequences for breaking the law. When it comes to Hillary Clinton, I would agree with you, actually. I think these people should be held to account to a much greater degree, but I don't explain all of these discrepancies with some kind of like evil political deep state agenda as much as just there's different prosecutorial discretion and different judges in different cases.
And there's the word. Every time I debate someone on this, they will write everything away as prosecutor discretion. So my answer, so let's take that to the logical. My answer when it comes to Eric Adams is prosecutor discretion. They have discretion to not pursue people, therefore no problem. Why do you automatically assume it's
legally?
Yeah,
they dropped the charges. Sure,
cool. So it's just prosecutor discretion. So what's this topic even about? Conduct. Secondly, did Hillary Clinton's team comply?
With what specifically?
When they were asked to return evidence.
No.
Did they eventually get the evidence that they requested of Trump?
With the classified documents case? I mean, they raided Mar-a-Lago and took
it. So they got it. Did they ever get it from Hillary?
Not to my understanding, no. I mean, I also want to say I'm not super familiar with the Hillary case. Like 2016 was a while ago at this point, but I'm taking your word that you're not misrepresenting anything.
I'm familiar with sort of the talking points. Oh, prosecutor discretion. Oh, it was a long time ago. The point I'm trying to make is I don't think it's particularly. I don't think there's all of these crimes that they're going after Trump for that he may have committed them. Right? My estimation is 90 to 95% of people at the national level of politics have committed all sorts of crimes. For example, I ran for Congress. I'll be honest with you. Some of the laws understanding campaign donations, you could run afoul.
Don't incriminate yourself.
No, I took $0, so it didn't matter. But just looking into that's one of the reasons I intentionally took $0 because as a layman, right? But you could easily run afoul of those without intending whatsoever. It doesn't mean you didn't commit a crime. The problem is they decided from day one, as Chuck Schumer said, we're going to go after this guy because he's criticizing us. So in all of these states, you had people like Letitia James, people like Fani Willis. You had people like Alvin Bragg. You had people like James Comey at the FBI. You had the people at Noerr. All of them constantly are like, we investigate Trump more, investigate Trump more. They illegally spied on him. Meanwhile, when we have apples to apples comparisons, okay, in 2016. He's running against Hillary Clinton. She mishandles classified documents. She destroys it, or her team destroys them. Well, no problem. We're not going to charge any.
Legal cases are almost never actually going to be apples to apples. I think that does a lot of heavy lifting for your argument. The point that I'm trying to make here is, like, for example, I believe it was a judge in a red state that struck down Biden's student loan forgiveness before it went to the Supreme Court. And I wasn't out here saying, like, the Republican judges, the activist judges are coming after Biden. I think, like, respecting rule of law, even when it goes against people that I might support or policies that I might like, is important to do. And a trend that I notice with, I don't want to speak about you because I'm not very familiar with your content, but people who are Trump adjacent, is that it just always conveniently that every judge who goes against Trump just happens to be an activist judge. It's not like you're saying, I think the classified documents case and the Georgia case were strong, but I think the other case was weak. You're just saying, like, by virtue of Trump being indicted, that it speaks to some sort of, like, issue. And then it's like, okay, if it's in a blue state, that also, I guess, takes away all credibility, even though Democratic policies have been challenged in red states before, and that still stood. My issue here is not to say, like, every prosecution is always perfect, but it's this, like, reductive explanation of the evil deep state.
It's not reductive when I can talk. My fundamental.
We'll respond to this, Rob, and then we'll move on.
My fundamental argument with politics is that there are bureaucrats and people behind the scenes that are really running things, and what they do is they aggressively go after people that they don't think would allow them to keep their hegemony on power. Right. So, for example, when you say, "Oh, this is just it's prosecutor discretion," it was a long time ago. We can see the people that were running the FBI and Noerr that were making these decisions were doing things like this. Peter Strzok talking about needing an insurance policy to prevent Donald Trump from winning. We could see that Kevin Kleinsmith was tweeting out #resist when he was later charged with the crime when he intentionally manufactured evidence to say the opposite of the truth to continue to get FAR warrants against Donald Trump. We could see that James Comey was talking about how he hated Trump from the get-go and was keeping notes on him and how he's holding Hillary mugs and actively cheering for Hillary. He even said that the reason that he was forced to reopen the Hillary investigation at the end was because a whistleblower spoke up because they weren't covering Anthony Weiner's laptop that had the, please let me finish. And so his reason for reopening it, contrary to the popular Democratic narrative, wasn't to harm Hillary, but it was to help Hillary because he assumed that she was going to win and he didn't want this to be an albatross around her neck. Over and over again, we can see, I'm not talking about the judges, but the people at these agencies that are the real problem. The real problem is not Joe Biden. It's not Hillary Clinton. I don't give a shit. The real problem is, like Chuck Schumer said, we have the most powerful law enforcement agency in the history of the world in the FBI, that Chuck Schumer, the opposition to Donald Trump, said Trump can't criticize them or well, they'll find 6 ways from Sunday. And now for more than 8 years, they've done exactly that. That's my argument. And we can see the selective prosecution. And that's more of a threat than how big of a deal do you think mishandling classified documents is on a scale of 1 to 10?
Just mishandling them, not the obstruction of justice part?
Yes.
Scale of 1 to 10, maybe like somewhere between a 4 to a 6.
Okay, so they're rating a former president over something you would say is a 4.
Of justice.
How bad do you think it would be if we have an FBI that's intentionally going after their opponents and then protecting the people they see as allies? How bad would that be on a scale of 1 to 10?
In the premise that you laid out, it obviously would be bad, but I obviously would reject that premise as being true, right? Because, like, again, when you talk about,
what did I say that was inaccurate?
When you talk about things like Operation Crossfire Hurricane, there was an inspector general investigation into this under Trump, and they said, yes, mistakes were made in terms of the process that were followed. But again, the issue that I have with what you're saying is,
you're misrepresenting what they said. He said in the summary of that, it's not even a problem of changing policy. Until the culture at the FBI is radically changed, no change in policy will matter. That's as scathing of an indictment as you could get. That's from the Durham report. That's from the Durham report.
Right, and that Inspector General report in 2019 said there was no political motivation.
That's not what that said either. What it said was that they were unable to prove a political motivation. He was asked, if you want to go through this real quick.
Shouldn't you be able to prove it?
No, right? Because the Inspector General was asked, he had a 4-hour hearing, right? And he was asked specifically on this question. How do you explain? He said the absolute worst thing that he saw in the FISA abuse was as follows. That the FBI kept saying, we've talked to the primary subsource 1, a man that would be a suspected Russian spy named Igor Danchenko. Right? They got 2 warrants without talking to the subsource. The 3rd warrant, they went to the FISA court and said, we talked to Igor Danchenko and we think he told the truth. So then they got a 3rd FISA warrant. The Inspector General goes, what was so appalling about this was, you know what he told the truth about? He said, wait a minute, that was all bar talk. I don't have proof of any of this.
Wait. Correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't the FBI investigation into this start because of a tip from an Australian official about like George Papadopoulos?
Well, supposedly now we're seeing evidence that actually Brennan was saying in notes that actually they were telling in July before this started, they were saying that Hillary Clinton had a plan to tie Trump to Russia,
It did
and that
start
was
in
going to be
July.
part of our right. But at the end of July, I believe the official start date was July 31st. We will
Okay.
find out if evidence is released that they actually started the investigation before then. Nonetheless, yes, if you want to go into the story of Alexander Downer, we can. Irrelevant to
don't
what
wanna
I'm
get
talking.
caught up on
Irrelevant
this,
to what I'm talking about the IG. So I'll just finish this point. Imagine that they have to tell the FISA court the truth. They say we finally talked to the guy. He told the truth, but they left out. Oh, and what he told the truth was that this whole case was bullshit. And he's like, that is unthinkable. It's unconscionable. And the Democrats on that were questioning kept saying, but you didn't find every proof that it was politically motivated. And he said, no. Finally, a Republican says, other than the most grotesque incompetence that you can imagine, or corruption and political motivation, can you think of a third excuse for why this happened? He said, no. And they said, so you're not saying it's not political corruption. He said, that's not what I'm saying. My job's only to recommend charges. I can't say that it rises to the level of corruption. So you're misrepresenting.
I think this comes down to just like a view of the world difference where you attribute things to malice, where I would attribute them to probably just like honest mistakes with some malice sprinkled in there as well. But
what's
I
the honest mistake of that?
Good time to move it on, I'd say, fellas. Let's get into the whole gender argument. Trump, one of the more popular things that he's done with the Republican base is to be, obviously declaring that there are only two genders, etc. So, Adam, maybe you want to kick this one off. How do you feel about Trump's policies in that regard?
Yeah, when it comes to things like sports, I mean, I would much rather have the sports organizations make these decisions based on what makes sense to them and working with sports scientists when they're looking at things like lung capacity and bone density, which are some of the bigger issues when you're talking about people that transition playing in sports of the opposite sex. Broadly speaking, like a lot of this just seems like virtue signaling stuff where he's like, there are two genders and I proclaim that to the world. And it's like, I guess that's like fine. The issue that I have more so is with things like not allowing trans people to serve in the military, when again, like my understanding is if you're getting into the military, there's probably some standard you have to meet to even make it into there. So like whether or not you're trans, I don't think should have a bearing on that. Broadly speaking, when it comes to things like sports, again, I'm not a medical professional, but my assumption would be like, yeah, especially with combat sports, you probably do want to separate sexes just for safety purposes. But I don't think that this is like a good faith effort from Trump to like parse through the scientific literature and figure out like what are the bone density differences and lung capacity differences. It's more so just like virtue signaling for people that are very anti-trans, culturally speaking.
The reason that there's a portion of quote virtue signaling is because so much of what we've been gaslit into for the past 15 years on this issue itself was virtue signaling. It's actually an insidious cultural maneuver that's being made, and we're indoctrinating everyone, including children, into this cult of a sort of this neo-humanist, oh, you can change your biological sex. It's absurd, right? And it's the people, again, have voted with their feet. It's an 80-20 issue for a reason. We're tired of them. We're tired of not just the sports issue. We're also tired of them chemically altering children. Other countries that we're told have better healthcare systems like UK have put a stop to this because they said that the evidence that's being put forth hasn't been thoroughly studied, and we should not be medically testing and chemically altering or physically altering in the terms of surgery people that are not of the age of consent. It is monstrous that we're doing this. So
How widespread do you think these procedures are?
It doesn't matter if it only happens to one person. It's irrelevant. The point is that this is being pushed it is being pushed as a virtuous issue. It goes hand in hand with the sexualization of children and other people. And I'm more than happy that we're pushing against this. On the sports issue specifically, I'm interested in this point. You say it should be left up to each sports body. So even when you're talking about like MMA, do you think that the government doesn't have a role? It should just be up to, for example, UFC to say.
I don't think any MMA organization would allow, like, if they are evaluating the current scientific literature.
That's not the question.
This is about outcomes.
But you're saying that it should be up to every specific sports organization.
Who can play in what category? Sure.
Okay, so you would say that there's no government role. The government shouldn't be providing incentive or penalties when it comes to sports, and what sort of sports are being offered. And who
in combat sports, there might be a point that you have there, but again, you'd agree there's some sports where like sex probably doesn't make a huge difference.
Okay, let's take combat sports out of it. How about baseball?
I mean, I'd have to see like what the literature is. Again, this is the thing. Like we're acting like we're doctors here, discussing like specific.
No. I'm not acting like I'm making a specific point. I'll get to. I'm asking as a general theory. You're saying that ultimately the government shouldn't have any role in saying, "Hey, this is who's allowed to participate in this sport, or this is what happens in this sport or not." That's your general theory.
I mean, I'm sure there's basic protections that they have to afford, but again, what do you mean by that? I
Explain
guess
Title IX. Were you in favor of that?
is that just like a sex-based equality being
Right. So
confirmed?
Title IX, I think it was, I can't remember, 70s, 80s, but the idea behind it was that the federal government said that they were going to withhold funding to universities unless they offered equal amounts of sports for females as males. Now, one of the net effects that this had was it actually massively decreased in many areas male sports that were offered. So take a university I went to. Let's say that it offered 14 athletic competitions or sports for men and only 2 for women. Well, if under Title IX they decided this has to be equal, maybe they could only get up to 8 for women. So they were forced to cut back to only 8 for men, or they would run afoul of Title IX and they would lose a lot of their government funding. Are you against Title IX funding that says that each university that receives government funds must offer equal sports for males and females?
If you're describing it accurately, then I'm not in favor of colleges cutting back sports. But again, it also probably
Let's say
depends
that
on
they
like,
didn't. Let's say
it
that
also
some of
depends on like what is the actual demand for women to play different types of sports? Like, is there enough demand to create 14 different sports leagues for women? Like, I'd much rather have it go on a case by case basis there.
Okay, but that's not what happened. It said, let's just say in theory, forget about they removed male sports even. Let's just say in theory that this law said, or Title IX said, it has to be equal sports for men and women. And they were
Yeah.
able to find enough women's sports to equalize it. Are you in favor of that?
Then sure, yeah. Why wouldn't they offer the same opportunities to both sexes if there's equal numbers of people that want to
So
play
you
those
would be in
sports?
favor of the federal government withholding funding to say like Duke University if they offered in 2020 or 2020 they offered
Assuming it
20
holds
male.
up and assuming it holds up constitutionally speaking, like I'm taking your word for all this. I'm not super familiar with Title IX,
Okay,
but
what do you mean
that's
assuming
the
that it holds up? We're asking what your opinion would be.
my opinion would be you're asking if it's justified for the federal government to withhold funds, and there's going to be certain parameters that dictate justification.
Okay, well, given that, if you're somehow saying if that's constitutional, you'd be for it, and it hasn't been revoked for as long as it's been there, then why wouldn't the federal government have a say in intervening in female-only spaces?
I already said that when there's like basic safety precautions, that's fine. But
It has nothing
depends
to do with that. Ping
what
pong.
do you mean by intervening is the question. Like such a broad term.
Like, if the idea behind Title IX was female deserve female-only sports, and it wasn't just, oh, just for combat sports, it was
Yeah.
sports in general, and you're like, yeah, I think that's okay for the government
If
to
you're
say.
asking me broadly, I don't think that people should be able to play in sports of the opposite sex. That's my broad
But
umbrella.
you're saying that
opinion on
that
this.
should be up to each individual
But I
athletic
think that
body, not the federal government.
the reason that I caveat that is number one, the medical literature is evolving. And I'm sure there are some sports like fucking chess, which is not even under discussion, but like you can imagine sports where it probably doesn't make a difference.
Well, that's not true. It depends on what you mean makes a difference. Like, even when it comes to chess, it might intuitively be to you that males have no
bone density and lung capacity, which
listen,
can be different
but
even
listen,
if you transition before
but
puberty.
again, there's a red herring going on here. We're not just talking in sports or competitions where females could get hurt because of bone density.
That's the 80-20 issue you mentioned, though. That is the
That is
80-20.
okay. Nonetheless, that's not what we're talking about. That's not what Title IX was about. It was about opportunities. And you deflect from,
Okay.
well, my personal proclivity would be we don't have biological men in female sports. But you're
Yeah.
also making the argument that the government doesn't have a say in that. But we have a history in this country of the exact opposite. That the government has, since Title IX, been
Yeah.
threatening to withhold funding, saying that we need female-only spaces, and not just female-only spaces in athletics where it's somewhere they could get hurt.
Yeah.
And so so this isn't a radical departure. This falls in line with what we've seen.
Okay. And what exactly is your question on this?
Well, the point is, when your point was, I don't think the government should be involved, they already are. They've been for
Sure.
decades.
Hold on. Again, I said the government's going to be involved in some capacity with anything having to do with sports. There's athletic commissions in different states for professional sports and college sports. Like you're just using very vague language. I don't know what exactly you mean by some of these terms.
I don't know. Can you explain?
Like I agree. I agree fundamentally. The government obviously plays some role in sanctioning and regulating all sports and the actions of many colleges. What specific regulations are we talking about here?
Okay,
The
I'll say
example
this.
that you gave, I agreed with you in that, like,
If
if
you're
you're
willing to
cutting
accept-
back on male sports, I think that's a bad
If you're
thing.
willing to accept that the government could regulate that each university they send money to should have equal sports for men and women, then are you also willing to accept that they could regulate saying biological men can't be in the women's sports?
Well, I think they should be able to regulate that contingent on the actual demand for equal sports between the two sexes. Like, if no
that's-
women want to play basketball, for example, at a certain college, you shouldn't mandate that college to offer women's
Okay, so
basketball.
then you were against Title IX because that's what Title IX
sure.
did. It didn't say
Okay.
specific sport to sport. It said you had to have equal. So, for example, maybe you didn't have enough women interested in basketball, but you had a diving team.
Yeah, that seems like painting with a broad brush where you could use more
Well,
specific
that's what the
colors.
government did. So you're against that,
Okay.
and you're also against the government. So fine, you're against what has been
And
precedent
again,
in our
like,
country
I'm
for a long
taking
time.
all
Great.
of your descriptions for this just for granted that there's no right-wing framing on any of this. I'm just taking this for your
Sure,
word. Okay.
that's fine. The other thing is it's interesting because it juxtaposes to the conversation about Trump withholding funding from places like Colombia. When it comes to Title IX, there was an infamous memo that was sent out during the Obama administration that said they were applying Title IX to say that if universities didn't take accusations of like sexual assault, impropriety, etc., seriously, that they could withhold federal funding to these universities. Now, the net result of that was things like the UVA rape hoax, right, and Mattress Girl, where you had all of this
What
swath.
is Mattress Girl?
Mattress Girl was this girl that became famous that was doing like a performance art project where she walked around with a mattress on her back. And her claim was that she was at some frat party and there was like some gang assault against her. It turned out it was all bullshit. She just made this up. And there was this rash of lack of due process on university that overwhelmingly harmed men, but sometimes harmed women, where there was a rush to any time that there was any bad hookup, not rising to the level of sexual assault. You were incentivized to run to your school as quick as possible and make the first accusation, because these schools were so fearful under Barack Obama and these Title IX restrictions that they were going to lose their funding that they just said, "Hey, man, you're off campus."
That again seems to me like a policy that probably is not tailored to fight the issue it's meant to be fighting. I mean, I'm sure you would agree there's probably a massive issue with things like sexual assault on college campuses, right?
Well, any one sexual assault would be bad, and I think we should do something. So when you say
So,
massive, I don't
this
know.
is not like meant to be a gotcha. Like you would agree, we should probably try to increase like.
Well, right. I'm
capturing,
just saying, like,
identifying these
the
examples.
reason that I hesitate to say yes is because the numbers that were cited as sort of the reason for this was like 1 in every 3 women were raped. I don't think it's that massive, but I would say that there's
Sure.
certainly thousands of people that are
It's
harmed. And
definitely
that's
statistically very significant and probably higher on college campuses than other places.
I don't know if that's true. There's interesting
With frat
research.
parties and hazing stuff. Like I can promise
These
you
are
some weird shit going
stereotypes.
on.
These are stereotypes that oftentimes are cited.
I
but don't
lived
seem to
on the
bear-
campus of University of Michigan. I can promise you some weird shit goes on at frat
So
parties.
you saw rapes? Did you report them?
I never said I saw rapes. I've heard about
Okay.
crazy hazing though.
So when we're talking about hazing, that's not the same as sexual assault.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the code of conduct on these campuses sometimes is like a little bit insane. So it wouldn't be surprising.
What
that
does
people are
hazing
getting,
mean, guys? Is that something? Is that
it's like
a lingo
initiation
that I'm-
into frats. Like you eat like a raw goldfish, or like someone died once because they were in a car trunk on the freeway. Like a lot of weird shit you have to do to prove
It's
yourself.
like
to get into
bullying, like when you get jumped into a gang, that would be
Yeah.
hazing. What you see on frat, like frat hazing, if you watch movies with like old school and stuff, you remember when they throw the bag over that dude's head and throw him in the back of the van? That's hazing.
I don't see the problem with hazing myself, but there's always different initiations at different football clubs
Sure.
and stuff. But I
It's-
guess anything that goes into crimes would be bad.
Well, right.
Sure,
There
instances
could
where
be
people have
hazing
died
that's
and gotten injured
harmless.
and sick, so.
But like if part of the hazing is like, we're going to break your arm, that would probably be a problem. But yeah, but the point I'm trying to make is I don't think it's as clear as you're saying. Nonetheless, even if it is a problem, that, and we can say, yes, sexual assault on campus is a problem, no problem. Like the way that went about it, we again saw that Democrats were more than happy to have the federal government intervene and threaten to withhold funds to universities when it came to wanting equal amount of women's sports as men. Now they're taking the opposite tack, saying that biological males should be in female sports. And when it came to these Title IX, this absurd like rush to no due process,
Okay.
how to reject, we could see that they were withholding funds.
So
But now
again-
they're crying a foul when the Trump administration is using things like the Civil Rights Act to try to withhold funds from places like Harvard.
We should talk about the Harvard thing in a second, but my broad take here again is because I'm not super familiar with the Title IX stuff. I can only speak in regards to what principles I hold. The reason I'm skeptical of what you're saying is because there's been so many examples. Like I think the Vikram Ramaswamy brought up that like the Department of Education is cutting off funding from schools that like don't allow archery or something. And then it turns out when you read into it, it was just like a wording issue in the law under Congress, and they amended that. So like when it comes to educational funding, forgive me for saying that I maybe don't take everything you say at face
Completely
value.
fair. I would not expect you to.
I can only share my principles on this, which are that number one, I think as a broad rule, you should have sex-based distinctions in competitive sports at a college level and professional level. Elementary school stuff, like I don't give a fuck if dodgeball is like mixed gender or whatever. I think most people agree on that. When it comes to the concept as being an 80-20 issue, it is 80-20 in sports. When it comes to virtually everything else, like trans people being in the military, or just generally speaking, what is the cultural attitude towards trans people who are a very, very small portion of the population? And another reason I just take issue with this conversation is that, like, sure, I'm not saying it's not important, but in terms of like when we rank the top issues facing America, would this be in your top 10?
Yes, because the reason that it's there is because it's not just this specific issue, though. Anytime you're talking about the mutilation of children and the sexualization of children, that's certainly a top issue. It's because it's indicative of the major problem with our country, which is that these issues are forced down people's throats that sort of causes like a morality loss and a division
Do
amongst
you
people.
think
It's an
sex
example of
reassignment
cultural
surgeries
Marxism.
are forced down people's throats?
Yes, I think that the acceptance of this
There's an
and having to
extremely
ignore,
long
I think
process
that the
to get even
acceptance,
approved for that.
I think the acceptance of accepting that a 3-year-old could declare that they're actually a female when they were born a biological male, and having to pretend that that's not grotesque and weird, and being told that should be shamed, falls in line with the same sort of arguments that white people should be shamed and Christians should be shamed
I
and
just want to
men
make sure
should
we're
be
clear
shamed.
that when it
Yes,
comes to
fighting
things like
that is
hormone,
important for its
yeah,
own sake.
when it comes to things like hormone therapy and sex reassignment surgery, this is like a last resort after going through so many different types of therapy and other interventions.
true.
It's not like people are just, I mean, there's medical
We have
guidelines on
whistleblowers.
this.
We have whistleblowers that have spoke up that said
Sure,
that
if
hormone
someone's
blockers are
violating
prohibited.
medical guidelines, then obviously like prosecute them for that, and you should be
And I
exercising.
just want to clear out, like, we're now seeing a story from the New York Times just this week that's basically saying, hey, guess what? That prescribing Ritalin and Adderall to all these children, yeah, sorry, that was just a big scam to make pharmaceutical companies
Hold on.
money.
This is now a
trans
totally
issue is
different
but the
topic
point,
than
the
sex
tangential,
reassignment surgery.
but the reason I'm saying this is because it's huge business, the sex reassignment surgery, and saying like, well, there are laws and you have to go through certain procedures. There are loopholes to get around that, and whistleblowers have talked quite frequently, including
Sure,
people that have
I'm all in favor of
detransitioned about how
having
terrible
medical
it is.
ethics and medical guidelines. I have a friend in medical school, and I can tell you one of the reasons I don't like talking about this is because people like to pretend like this is all very black and white and clear cut. My gut feeling on this is that I'm probably against these types of procedures for minors. But again, like when we talk about these procedures, they are so insanely rare and there's so many hurdles you have to go through before you get them that I'm imagining like in the cases where someone is getting these procedures, it's a last resort after years of therapy and trying everything else. If people are rushing to this, obviously I have an issue with that because it's like irreversible in some
But
cases.
the rare thing's an interesting argument because we're told as a society we have to bend over backwards for a very rare condition, which is trans.
What do you mean by bend over backwards?
Like every space that we have has to be infiltrated now by people that are pretending, and we have to accept their
Maybe if you're
bullshit.
in
Let me give you an example.
Like
For example, I've been banned on Twitch for misgendering someone. I have to accept on one of the biggest live streaming social media platforms that I have to pretend that a trans person who's a biological male is a biological female. I have to do that at work. Almost every place of employment in this country. We have DEI hires, which is a thing that's tangential to this, that we've prioritized hiring people. We've created victimhood as one of the biggest social currencies and one of the best ways to be a victimhood, particularly if you're white and a male and you can't get into that victimhood classification.
What is the big issue with like if someone looks entirely like a woman, just calling them her? Like I'm trying to understand, like just on like an interpersonal level, like what's the issue?
Previously, if they asked me, I would happily do that. If they demanded I do, that'd be different. The problem is it didn't just stop at the level of, hey, I'm asking you nicely to do this. It was a constant infiltration of spaces over and over again.
Sure.
And it's occurring simultaneously at a time where it's occurring, this sort of cultural Marxist bullshit is occurring against white people, is occurring against Christians, is occurring. And like, for example, while this is going, we're also being told, well, we have to have drag queens in children's spaces, and we have to have critical race theory being taught to children in school, and we have to teach children that actually you're not born a male or a female, like, and we have to take off birth certificates like mother and father. All of this stuff is a concerted effort.
The issue that I have
shoehorn
with the way that you're framing this conversation is we always focus so much on the fringes to talk about the broader group of transgender people, and like most transgender people are probably just like dressing differently and they want to be called by a different name and pronoun. That is the vast majority. And I always question the motives of like, why are we focusing so much time and energy? I'm fine to have the conversation as I've been having, but why are we focusing so much time and energy on the fringes of a group that by and large is like just trying to like live their life and not face discrimination?
Because they are at the forefront of sort of victimhood culture and DEI has shoehorned itself into every institution in this country.
Well, DEI, again, there's a lot of people that define it incorrectly. DEI typically just expands applicant pools without lowering standards. Like when Trump talked about the FAA having DEI, they just increased their applicant pools to people that did not have access to extracurriculars in school and who didn't have a long work history. DEI, in many cases, does not actually mean you're lowering standards. It just means you're broadening application pools. And that's sort of like
that's not DEI. The equity. What does equity mean?
Depends on who you ask.
Okay, well, traditionally, what it ends up meaning in practice is
Fairness.
equal outcome. And this is another thing that happens over and over. What happens is we're told, no, this isn't happening. This isn't happening, like the border. And then when we find out it is happening, they're like, yeah, it happened, but it was a good thing. So I could tell you, we can
No,
go through the list. We can
people
go
are
through the
getting
list.
hired on
People like
lower standards. I oppose that.
Right. So we could go through a list of someone like Christopher Rufo has put together that shows at universities, that shows that many major corporations, their DEI has resulted in hiring people not based on merit, but based on these categories.
I'm quoting
But
the FAA.
anecdotally, I can tell you, and I'm sure that almost everyone in this chat could back this up if you don't want to look at studies. You personally know companies, maybe I'm working for one right now, that has quotas that says that we need certain people. I have a friend that works for a government defense contractor that's
Isn't that
telling me that it's
unconstitutional?
fucking laughable that they're basically being said that everyone in a supervisory position
Hold
or
on.
higher by 2030 has to be someone from a minority
Aren't
class.
race-based hiring quotas literally unconstitutional?
No, well, I think that they should be, but I think that they're applied in many ways.
Affirmative action was struck down by the courts, and I see a big conflation between DEI and affirmative action in many cases. And again, when I bring up them not lowering standards, I'm quoting from the FAA website, which is sort of the zeitgeist that brought this into the public conversation, is Trump saying these crashes are happening because of FAA DEI. When you actually read the DEI guidelines, they just expanded the applicant pool. They did not lower standards.
I don't believe that they're being accurate in most of the institutions like this. And I personally know, and there's stories that have been reported that we could see actual proof of it, of DEI
Sure,
prioritizing hiring people based on race, based on other
I
minority
oppose
status.
that. If you can find me specific cases, I will stand with you in opposing that. I just don't think that that's the norm.
Well, you mentioned Harvard. Will you admit that Harvard's application processes should have been unconstitutional based on the fact they were prioritizing people of color?
Yeah, I oppose affirmative action.
Okay, so the fact that that
And
occurred,
it's now unconstitutional.
what's that?
It's now unconstitutional.
Okay.
It has been for a while. So I just like, if it's happening, then sure. Like if there's,
Do you think it ceased to happen now?
In large part, probably, yeah.
I think that you're full of it. I think that it just ignores the reality. I think
And,
that if you're a
the
large
Harvard
company,
thing-
you might not put down like, oh yeah, we're only hiring a black person. But when that black person comes in, or when that trans person comes in, or when that woman comes in, or when that Muslim comes in, you're like, this will look really good if we could tout 30% of our supervisory forces people that are minorities.
Do you think that they are then assuming that I'm taking this for granted, your premise, that they're then saying, okay, this guy has a lower SAT score, we're still going to take him?
In Harvard
Just in general,
or in
application-
universities, I think that
Yeah.
probably occurs.
Still?
Yes. Now
Okay,
I haven't seen the data. I haven't seen the data, but the
data
most
or court cases on that. If it does occur, I will agree that I think that's bad. I don't think it
most
should play a
recent
role.
data that I've seen, I think, was circa 2023. I could be wrong. I'd have to pull up the study, by the way, I appreciate this debate. I'm having a lot of fun. Neither of us have been pulling up big studies. And I think not just you shouldn't trust me and I shouldn't trust you, but the audience should try to do their own research as well, because sometimes we're citing things, right? But we're giving sort of the benefit of the doubt. I believe it was 2023 is the most recent data I saw on that.
Yeah.
That was actually, it's Asian Americans. It's like that their SAT score has to be so many points higher on average to get into the institution. And then when you filter down, you get to whites, then you get to Hispanics, and then you get to blacks. It's like the average applicant for a university like Harvard that's black is like a 1380 SAT
The question
score.
there, though, is like, are they indexing based on race, or does that just happen to be the distribution because they're indexing based on like socioeconomic background, which you'd agree that's fair to take into account, right?
I don't have a problem taking in socioeconomic background, but I think that it's clear. I think that it's clear.
Well, what about if
it's
someone's a
tied to
foreign
race.
exchange student? They maybe bring like a different cultural attitude from a different country.
I don't understand the question. What
Like,
about
could that be sort of like a one-up on someone's application that they come from somewhere that's like foreign and maybe they bring like a different cultural perspective with that as well?
I don't think we should prioritize things like that. No, I think
Okay, so
socioeconomics. I think socioeconomics a little different, and I think even in there that it should be very tight. That it's still put through a merit system that they have. Like it's like anything. Like let's take it out into like a firefighter because it's easier for people to understand. There should be a minimum standard for getting into being a firefighter. Is it okay if we say, well, if you meet that minimum standard and this guy met that minimum standard, but you're from a poorer neighborhood that will hire you? It's debatable. I would say most of the time no, but at university it makes more sense why you'd want to try to prioritize people.
As
But you still have
someone
to meet that minimum standard.
As someone who applied for undergrad in 2019, which I believe might have actually been before affirmative action was struck down by the courts, I can promise you need really good stats to get into a lot of these schools. Like I went to University of Michigan, and like if you're applying with like a 1200 SAT, it doesn't matter what skin color you are, you're not getting in.
So
that's more anecdotal, I'll admit, but that's being involved in the process.
Let's move it on to the anti-Semitism debate. Now, this is an interesting one. Just before we get there, guys, if you are watching and you haven't smashed that like button, then I would appreciate you doing that, getting this out far and wide. We are just over halfway to the grift goal, guys. So any sort of kangaroo coins that will go towards the Mrs. Rattlesnake Fund would be fantastic. So we're going to move on to the anti-Semitism debate now. And this is an interesting one because from the left, you have a lot of protests happening on campus at the moment in terms of the cause in Gaza. And then from the right, you've got a fair bit of pushback happening as well in terms of people thinking that Donald Trump is too focused on anti-Semitism as a cause. So I'm interested to hear both perspectives here. Maybe, Rob, you want to kick this one off and how you feel about this particular debate.
I don't know. I'm not a big fan of, I'm not for hate speech laws, and I'm going to throw Adam a bone here. I think that one of the chagrins I have of the Trump administration, I understand people could argue that it's not this case, but my gut feeling and looking at the preponderance of circumstantial evidence is they're putting a double standard to the criticism of Israel and people that want to criticize Israel versus maybe if you wanted to criticize France or hell, even the United States. And I think that's shameful. I think there have also been legislations, not by the Trump administration specifically, that I'm aware of, though I'm open to hearing that. But certainly I'm aware of some state legislations that seem to enshrine language that sounds very much like DI woke shit that we would complain about, that all of a sudden has Israel on the other end of that. And I think that that sort of thing's despicable. One of the things I like about Trump is sort of his foreign policy that was more anti-interventionist. And so I would like to see him to do more to stop funding both Palestine and Israel and stop kowtowing to Israel, saying that we can't criticize them. This actually does lead to more anti-Semitism. When you say, here's a particular country that we're going to be harsher on your criticism of, it leads to people saying like, well, that's authoritarianism that makes me more likely to want to criticize them. Having said that, I'm aware that many of the people that have been targeted did more than just say, I don't like Israel. And I do think the United States has a right when people are guests in this country to kick them out for a standard that we would not do with the average citizen. So, for example, I think that I should be allowed to say, I hate America, death to America. I don't think that a person on a student visa should. I think we should kick them out. No, same thing. They're not a citizen. We are not
visa and green card in the same regard there.
I think that there is different levels of the standard, but my standard would be both of those are below citizen, and we are not obligated as a country to take people that are verbally saying they hate us and want to die.
Okay. A few things here, like with visas, that's probably the least protected class, where it's like they can probably be deported for whatever reason, unfortunately. But like even there with Rumeysa Ozturk, who was the woman who was like abducted by the people without any law enforcement clothes on. There was like a video that went viral. There was a State Department memo that leaked that basically said that they had been targeted to investigate her for anti-Semitism and terrorist sympathies. They found nothing of the sort. And the law that Marco Rubio invoked, I might have the actual text of it if I can pull it up, but there is a very good reason to believe that it is unconstitutional. I think Trump's own sister actually ruled that it's unconstitutional because it basically says that the Secretary of State can remove any alien if he deems they would have some kind of adverse consequence for our foreign policy. That is insanely vague language that absolutely allows the First Amendment to be attacked. In the case of Mahmoud Khalil, which I think is the clearest case, he was a legal permanent resident. He had a green card. He's not here on a visa. He has a wife that's pregnant. Like, this is such a, to me, black and white case where he is being detained and possibly deported. It's going to be appealed now for expressing an opinion that's a political opinion. You're saying like, okay, citizens and green card holders and visa holders have different standards of what they get access to in terms of constitutional protections. And is that just going to be left up to the discretion of the president to then augment that to his own political beliefs?
I think that that's actually the biggest criticism. So now that we've laid the standard, I think the problem I would have with a lot of the Trump administration is they haven't outlined a clear, bright line. Let's say me and you would both accept, yeah, we don't have to take people on green cards or student visas that are doing a certain action that we think would be protected for a citizen.
I would say green card people still have First Amendment
rights.
Well,
I disagree with that, but nonetheless, let's just talk about the visa people just for the sake of this. If we agreed that there was some level of that, then the next question we would have would be, well, what's that level? Right? Like what, for example, if you're listening to this and you're on my side of the political ledger, let's say that Kamala Harris wins in 2028 and she says, okay, anyone that's here on a student visa and says we should stop funding Ukraine is clearly pro-Russian. So we're going to deport them. I would say no. There's a difference. Now, if they're saying, I hope Putin wins and takes over the United States, That's a different level. I think that arguably, but where is the threshold? And
I think once you start regulating speech like that, it's like who's drawing these lines? You can say we should stop funding Ukraine, but you can't say I support Russia. It's like where is the actual line between those two statements and how they're specifically worded?
So there'll be a problem, and you're going to need to some person talking about what that line is, and we may disagree on what that line is. But the alternative is worse. The alternative is worse. Allowing Democrats to massively import tens of millions of people, setting up a system that they can't be deported, and allowing them to verbally be like, we hate you, we want to kill you, and we say, well, we can't kick you out for that because who would draw the line?
How did we get from Mahmoud Khalil protesting Israel to like Democrats are shipping in legions of people that are saying we want to kill you? Like
no, you misunderstand. You argued against the premise of allowing any regulation of kicking people out based on their speech, and we do know that they are bringing in millions of people. That's not speculation.
Speech is like a call to violence. It's already like there's going to be legal problems there. But expressing political beliefs, I think, is like one of the most important types of speech we have to protect.
I disagree. If someone's expressing a political belief that would be protected speech from the United States, is it protected speech to say death to America for a U.S. citizen?
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have the right to kick someone out screaming death to America if they're here on a student visa?
On a student visa, maybe a green card, I don't think so.
I think we should on both. And so when you say you have a problem with someone drawing that line, you've already agreed that you accept someone drawing that line. The alternative is
on a legal basis. Visas are way more discretional in terms of how they're
real quick. So you've already accepted someone drawing that line. My argument is the alternative is worse. The alternative of saying that we would be forced if we bring someone into this country, including on a green card, that then openly advocates for the people of this country's destruction, that we have to accept them.
I fundamentally disagree with that. Said first of all, and even if it is what he said, even if that is what he said, I think he'd still be protected because again, when you're talking about like there has to be a line we can draw, the law that Marco Rubio invoked gives full discretion to one person to determine what counts as being like adverse to the foreign policy interests of the U.S. Who determines what the foreign policy interests are? Who determines what's adverse? What is the threshold you have to meet? One issue with this is that people are not given proper notice. When someone comes in on a visa or a green card, it's not like they're given a rubric of like, if you say this, you're going to get kicked out. How can you start holding people to account for speech violations when they aren't even given a rubric of what they are and are not allowed to say?
Okay, so but you already said you would be okay with that with people on student visas. Wouldn't the same argument
on the visa? I would disagree with the discretion of Rubio, but I think legally he probably has a stronger case here. But I would still disagree.
So then, what we're arguing, there is a law in the books that says what Rubio said. Now it's going to go to probably the Supreme Court to determine whether or not that's constitutional. When I'm arguing from is, I think that they'll say that the courts, I think, will say they're going to be closer to me than you. That's my prediction. That ultimately they'll say
think that law is constitutional.
I think that yes. I think that ultimately what the courts will say is that what Trump's team needs to do is have a more clear, bright line, and specifically what they're saying is the type of behavior. But ultimately, this law is constitutional, and the executive has the right to kick guests of this country out if they are giving sentiments that we think is detrimental to a certain level of the United States, like praising a terrorist.
Exact wording of this law, because it just like to me is like.
But what if you're wrong? What if they? So we're arguing. You're arguing the legality. I'm arguing the morality. If the court rules that you're wrong, then. You would have to say, well,
when there's overlap though between the morality and legality, like I think in the case of a green card, that's where I have a very strong opinion on this. Is like
they're still a guest. They're not a citizen. We have no obligation.
They're a lawful permanent resident of the United States.
Doesn't matter. They are a guest of the United States. We are under no obligation to accept guests that are openly advocating for our destruction.
Yeah, he's not committing crimes. There's like certain boxes he has to check. One of those boxes, it's not like when you get a green card, you're told like, hey man, don't be mean to Israel.
I don't care. Like they're told.
What kind of system is that?
I think that it's a system that is not. That system is better than
the system.
It's so
insanely arbitrary. What you can now say is like grounds to remove.
But that arbitrary nature and maybe trying to get hammering down on specifically what that is better than the alternative, which is once someone says whatever they need to say to get a green card, they could literally stand on the street and say, "I support ISIS, death to America," and we have to say, "Well, shucks, there's nothing we can do."
The argument you're making is the argument that people that oppose the First Amendment make, just broadly speaking. And the issue I have with it is like this is a very slippery slope. Once you start saying that there are certain words and certain ideas that once you convey them, it's grounds to remove you and revoke your green card, it's free reign for the Secretary of State to just apply that to whoever they want.
Again, you already fall into that same argument because you said you would accept some level of this on student visas. So
I'm talking about green cards. Mahmoud Khalil to me is the clearest case here.
I don't care. So then I'll say this. I'll come at this from the more left-wing perspective. What? You accept that on visas? That's a slippery slope. Next thing you know, they'll be saying it about green card holders and American citizens. See? So how's the slippery
Okay.
slope argument not to apply to you as well? My argument is
Hold
that
on.
it is a less
Illegal, a visa is by definition conditional and temporary.
Okay.
A green card is you have lawful permanent resident status in the U.S. And then
Nonetheless,
there's certain things you have to do to maintain that. You have to check in. But again, what I'm saying here is, like, even if you want to make this case that you're making, are people put on notice about what they are and are not allowed to say? Or is
Again,
it just like
what-
they have to hope and pray? I don't say the wrong thing on
I
Twitter
don't
today.
know. I don't know if you heard me. I said I think that ultimately what the court's likely to say is that you have to give some clear bright lines, right? So you would have to say, like, openly advocating for the following terrorist organizations, openly calling for the death of American citizens, openly calling for the destruction of the United States country. There's probably, I think the court will say there are certain like precursors that you have to give so that people are aware of this. But the world you're advocating for is far worse, which would be that, like, I don't know how to make this any clearer. You're literally advocating for a world where you say what you need to do to become a green card holder, and then you could literally say, I support ISIS, death to America, and we are not allowed to remove you from the country. That's insane.
Number one, extreme example. But even if I take that for granted that this extreme example takes place, how exactly is this? When you apply for a green card, there's like a very rigorous process. If you're like some undercover ISIS sympathizer, they probably would figure that out and not even approve your green card in the first place. Like, it's not like people are just coming in, they're getting a green card based on like one statement that they make.
Well, again, so you're saying that if let's say that you hate the American government and you're applying to come here, right?
Yeah.
Are you going to tell?
What does even that
Let me
mean, though?
finish.
What if
Let me
I
finish.
hate the American government because we don't have universal health care? Like, is that the same as saying I want everyone to die?
You feel they're systemically racist and the history of slavery means that they stole this country from indigenous folks and from black people. Okay?
You can say that if you have a green card.
Okay.
Are you against
So do you
that?
think? So do you think that you were applying for a green card? You would say, "Here's my beliefs on the United States. I hate them. I think they stole the land from the Native Americans. I think they need to give it back. I think they're systemically racist. I think we need radical changes to this country." How many people do you think that would actually believe that, would admit that in a green card hearing?
I mean, it wouldn't come up in a green card hearing.
Right. So then when you say, "Oh, well, they're back here and they're saying death to America, blah, blah, blah," that would have came up in a green card hearing.
How many people that tweet out death to America are actually like doing something about it? It's just like Twitter trolls.
It doesn't matter. The principle is that we should not have to accept people as guests in this country that hate us.
Hate us is a very, very ill-defined term. That's the issue I have here.
But you could say that. We could disagree on what hate us means, but the
what if you
principle
say
still
that
stands.
if you don't support the sitting administration, who is the active government, you hate America? Get out. If you don't support Biden or Trump or
again, I don't know how many times I have to repeat this. I think there's an argument to be made that there's going to be a problem with the threshold of this, and there need to be clear, bright lines that are outlined.
I'm saying that a threshold existing in the first place is grounds for abuse.
The principle still applies that as a principle, we should not be forced to accept people that hate us and want to destroy our way of life. We should not have to accept those people. You saying no,
threshold existing in the first place is the issue.
Let me finish. You saying no, we have to accept those people, because if we don't, someone could have a slippery slope and take it too far. I disagree. I think the harm of the slippery slope harm that you're talking about is a less significant harm than being forced to take people that are openly stating they hate us.
If there is grounds to believe someone represents an actual threat to national security through speech they are expressing, that is not the same thing as expressing that you just don't like America.
It doesn't have to be.
It doesn't have to be. I disagree. You keep saying that I'm not hearing your argument and that you think there should be a threshold. I'm saying the very existence of a threshold is rife for abuse based on who the Secretary of State is. And even in the case of visas, where I've said they have more justification, my point there is that revoking a visa has a much lower burden of proof to revoke the visa. I'm still not saying it would be adequate, I think. Like, let me ask you, if the Secretary of State says, I want to revoke this guy's visa because he says chocolate ice cream sucks ass, I love vanilla ice cream, would that be justified to you?
No.
Okay, so you agree there's some free speech protection.
I don't know how to. Yes, there is clearly a threshold that could go too far, right? That we clearly shouldn't be allowed to arbitrarily kick someone out for any reason, like saying I prefer vanilla ice cream.
That we're actually
Again,
referring
the two
to
problems
in real life that exist, like Rumeysa Ozturk.
I'll patiently wait for you to finish, and then I'll make my point.
Yeah, Rumeysa Ozturk, who is the one the video went viral for getting abducted. The State Department, at the behest of Trump and Rubio, investigated her and found no evidence of anti-Semitism or terrorist sympathies. So would you agree that she should not be deported?
I don't know. It would depend on what the ultimate conclusion is. It would
If you
depend on
take
what
for
she was.
granted what I just told you.
If it turns out that she's like, literally, I was just saying, hey, I want to go to my class. I never said anything.
She wrote an op-ed saying that we shouldn't fund Israel or something along those
Okay,
lines.
no, I don't think that that would be reason to deport her if that's all she did.
Okay.
I don't believe you that that's all they're claiming that she did.
Fair enough.
I don't
Fair enough.
believe you. Nonetheless, the point is, I'm talking about the principle that we shouldn't be forced to take people that are guests in this country that are openly advocating for their hatred of this country, right? You keep making this slippery slope argument is your only argument, an argument that you fall victim to. Because every single thing that you said, I could literally approach it more from the left and say, do you think that someone on a student visa should be kicked out for saying I like vanilla ice cream? Yes or no?
No.
Okay, well then you have a slippery slope because once you're saying that we could kick them out for saying death
You
to America,
understand there's
then they might
regulations on
then it
speech
would
that
be
exist
let me
even for
finish.
citizens.
Now again, I tried to be kind there and be quiet and let you talk.
Sure. Okay.
right?
My bad.
Okay,
Go ahead.
So
go ahead.
so again, then you fall for that same slippery slope argument because you're just like, well then what would stop the Trump administration from saying, well, you criticize Israel, so we're kicking you out for no reason whatsoever. And so therefore we have to not allow the threshold to exist whatsoever, and we can't kick people out for any speech whatsoever. Your answer to this is yes, but the standard of being a visa is a lower standard. There's more reasons that we can kick you out, and there should be stronger protections for a green card. Nonetheless, the same slippery slope argument would apply for the visa holder as it would the green card. You're merely making the argument that there's a stratosphere of green card holders should have more protections. I'm literally making the same argument, except I'm saying the green card holder is more akin to the student visa as opposed to the American citizen.
Yeah, the threshold that I'm talking about is a similar threshold that exists for citizens, though. You're talking about a threshold on expressing opinions. I'm talking about the gray area where speech can become incitement to violence, or there's even case law on like people providing aid to foreign terrorist organizations, whether that counts as free speech or not. Like there are some very bright lines when it comes to legitimate national security. The issue that I have, and this actually goes back to how we started this debate, which is that the Trump administration is using these blanket terms of national security and foreign policy to attack civil liberties. And this is one case where that civil liberty is free speech. There's other cases where it's the Fifth Amendment, but do you just not on a macro level see an issue with using these types of justifications to not to say, if you say I want to fund ISIS or I want to destroy America, there's a lot more of a clear risk or call to action there versus someone saying I don't like Israel or even I like Hamas.
Right. What I'm saying is I do have a problem with the way that Trump's been applying this, and I think that it's overly being used aggressively to criticize Israel.
Unconstitutional?
I don't know. It would have to determine what the facts are because the
What
problem
is
is,
your gut feeling on that?
my gut feeling is that they're probably going to go to the courts and the court's going to say you need to have more specific bright lines, and some of these individual people might not meet those bright lines and therefore they won't be deported. But I think the courts will ultimately rule that they have the right, that these laws that were cited by Rubio you're complaining about in practice are constitutional. Now, what I'm saying here specifically though is there's a fundamental disagreement on the principle of whether or not we should say that we aren't forced to allow guests in this country that are openly espousing hatred against the people of this country. What that hatred could be will be argued differently, and the threshold will be argued differently. Can people take that too far? Sure, of course. But I think that the principles should exist, that there is a certain level that we say this doesn't exist or it shouldn't be allowed. You say, well, you're saying the green card holder is more akin to the citizen. I'm just making the opposite argument. They're a guest. They're more akin to the visa holder. That's it. The only disagreement we have here is you're talking about slippery slope, this, that, and the other when it comes to the green card, but not the visa holder. I'm saying that just like you don't apply it to the visa holder, I don't apply that argument to the green card holder.
Well, even with the visa holder, I said if like they can't get deported for like not liking ice cream. I'm saying the Secretary of State.
I say the same with the green card holder.
No, I understand. The Secretary of State, just like statutorily, has more discretion in the revocation of visas than green cards. That's the only point.
I think that I'll be borne out. I think the Supreme Court's going to agree with me more on you than this. Having said that, I still stand by my opening statement and criticism here that I think that I have problems with the fact that the bright line's not being espoused by the Trump administration. And my gut feeling says that I think that this is being used to protect Israel, which I feel is despicable. And furthermore, the last thing I'll say about this, though, is I'm not saying you specifically. I work a lot and I haven't had a chance to look into a lot of these cases specifically, but I am aware that people constantly say, like with Khalil, oh, all he did was say like, hey, Israel's bad. But then I hear people saying, no, he lied in his visa. He was involved in protests that locked people out of certain buildings. He harassed student Jewish. So I don't know what the truth is on that. So when you say, so just real quick, and I'm certainly you can say what you want about this. I can't dispute you. I'm admitting I haven't looked into the facts.
Sure.
But when you say about other cases like, oh, this poor girl, it's the same as this Garcia guy, where constantly the people whose agenda is to never remove anyone, they're going to paint every single person that's removed is this angel that did nothing wrong. There's another side of the argument in almost every one of these.
Okay. When it comes to Khalil lying on his visa application, this is a completely phony allegation that people are making because basically he did a very short-term unpaid volunteering role for the UN and he didn't list it. He didn't list it in his work experience, which why would you list like unpaid volunteering under your job experience on your visa application? That is a supposed lie that he told where you wouldn't be expected to divulge that unless you're directly asked about it. And then secondly, when it comes to this is just the agenda of the people that want to bring in all the people and they're going to do whatever. Like, I obviously want to deport people that come in and commit crimes. People that have even come in recently illegally, I want to deport them as well. But regardless, even if you find the most heinous criminal on earth, all I'm arguing is that there are rules and regulations and procedures and processes that are enshrined by our Constitution and our norms in this country that once you start disobeying them, once you pass that Rubicon, we're in a totally different world now. And the entire macro argument that I'm making about Trump here is that he is using things that might facially seem like, oh, well, national security is important. People can't hate our country. Foreign policy is important. He uses these blanket justifications, but the actual actions he is taking under them represent, in my opinion, an existential threat to civil liberties, not just for visa holders, not just for green card holders, but for U.S. citizens as well.
It rings hollow to me when we just saw an information that wanted an administration that wanted disinformation panels that was using their agencies and funding NGOs to fight against free speech online, including doing things like censoring me for
Trump
opinions
is
on his
literally suing like a pollster for a poll he didn't like.
I don't care. The glass ceiling's
Why do
been
you just
broken.
not care when Trump's the one doing it?
The reason is because we accepted that the government has the right to do things like this. And when people like me were on the victimhood side of it, we were told, shut up, it's not happening. Or if it is happening, it's a good thing. And now as soon as the shoe's on the other foot, it's, oh my God, this is an existential crisis.
I agree with you. I think a lot of the Trump speech thing is revolted by like this revenge. Like we were fucked over for so long. Now we have to get them back with the exact same thing they did to us. Again, like also with Harvard, like he's pulling funding that goes to medical research, to one of the top medical research facilities in the country. And one of the demands that the government made to them is that we get to audit your courses and your professors to make sure that you have the right ideological balance. Is that not anti-free speech?
No, I think that first off, I think the U.S. government, do you think that the U.S. government, if anytime they fund something, it shouldn't be politically partisan that's skewed to favoring one side and ideology over another?
Say it again.
Do you think the government, my tax dollar is going to pay, that our government should have a right to make sure that the money that they're financing isn't politically partisan to an extreme level of one side or another?
Partisan implies like party, so sure.
Yeah.
But like when we're talking about like this professor is too liberal for me, that gets into some very dicey territory.
The problem is what we can see with all of this government funding, whether it be through not all, but a vast majority of it, when it comes to like USAID, money going to NGOs.
My God, we should talk about Doge more. Shit.
Money going to sort of academia, money going to media outlets like NPR, etc. It's almost all universally going to left-wing ideologues. Like, for example, we saw the head of, was it PBS or NPR? I think it was the head of NPR. She testified in front of Congress the other day, and she said, there's no ideological left-wing splint to NPR. And they were like, 90 out of the 90 people that you employ are registered Democrat and donate to Democrats. And she's lying to us and the American people. It's
how many MAGA people are like applying to work at NPR?
Right? This idea that we're constantly told like, well, no, there's no evidence. Like, what do you mean that Harvard would be too ideologically favoring the Democrats? It's bullshit. We all know it. You know it and I know it.
Okay, so saying people are culturally progressive is different than saying they're partisan. And again, like when you bring up the NPR example, how many like blood red MAGA Republicans are applying to work with Steve Inskeep at NPR? Like there's like a correlation causation that's happening
right,
here.
And the causation.
How many hard right conservatives are applying to work on Harvard's campus?
The causation, right? Two things to say about this. It's causation, right? The NPR is built up over years and years and years. You can see that Jonathan Haidt, who is a left winger, who I believe at least used to be a registered Democrat, I don't know, he runs something called Heterodux Academy. He's talked about this at university. Yes, it was always like back in the day, a 60-40 liberal to conservative sort of the faculty when you saw these universities. Now we see not only is it like 96% at many of these Ivy Leagues left, versus right, but the left have become far more radically left. The same is true of media outlets, right? We can see in places like NPR, we can see that it used to have somewhat of a left-wing spin that was within the realm of acceptability. Now it's radically left-wing and radically pro-Democrat. And the argument that like, oh, it's a violation of their free speech to say like, wait a minute, if we're going to force American tax dollars, which the majority of them at this point voted for the party that you're antithetical to, we have a right to ensure that that money is going for things that are beneficial to the country as a whole and not to attack the ideology of the people that are the majority of this country.
Okay, so a few things there. Again, I'll actually go a step further, specifically on college campuses. I do think that there is a cultural, progressivist, postmodernist bubble that exists on college campuses that is probably too overbearing, and there should be more ideological diversity. The way you get that, though, is not by using like holding hostage funds for like cancer research and shit again. And you mentioned USAID and how there's like maybe some wasteful spending here. I also just want to be clear that like USAID is like the #1 global funder of tuberculosis containment efforts.
It means
and
nothing.
It
literally means nothing.
Okay, well, 11,000 people have died of tuberculosis since.
Do you mind me asking, like, what's an issue that's really important to you? Like, are you a member of a church? Are you a member of like a union, something like that?
I mean, I do socialist is important to me.
Okay, let's say you're in a union, just for the sake of simplicity of this argument.
I actually was in a union.
What if I said this, like, hey, listen, U.S. government funding is going to go through USAID, and 10% of that's going to fight HIV, and 90% is going to busting up unions. And then when you say, wait a minute, I don't like that, I'd say, oh, why are you against HIV funding? That's despicable.
Can't you see the problem? The distinction that you're against the part that's going to bust up unions and you're in favor of the money?
No, because the problem is the way that this money's ran in these bureaucracies, they shift this money around all the time. For example, money that was spent that was geared for like humanitarian aid in like Thailand or something like that was actually rerouted by NGOs to create in Cuba a version of Twitter called Zunzania. Right. And the idea was
fraud going on again. Prosecute the fraud. So I haven't seen any prosecutions or indictments on fraud right now.
It has nothing to do with prosecuting the fraud. It has everything to do that this money is being earmarked for causes that are antithetical to huge swaths of this country, what I happen to be part of. Let me ask you this. Would you be perfectly fine then if we continue to fund HIV, but take every single dollar that goes to academic universities and send it to Hillsdale and Liberty, and take every single dollar that goes to media outlets and send it to Breitbart and Newsmax? Would you say that's okay as long as we're still funding HIV?
No, because these colleges that we're funding are doing like some of the most cutting edge research in technology and medicine. And I promise you, like, Hillsdale is not competing with like Harvard or UMich on like medical technology.
Once we start funding them for years, they may be.
No, it's also the talent pool that goes there and the network that exists there.
Maybe the talent pool will go there more if it becomes more prestigious because there's more money there.
Okay, well, we can maybe about that. I'm not against Hillsdale or anything, but when we're talking about using federal funding to try to force, and again, like what is the required ideological split? When Trump says Harvard, you need to be more ideologically diverse. Is it 50-50? Is it 60-40? Like this again just comes down to like
there's an interesting threshold.
The discretion of one man gets to determine who these colleges hire, what they're teaching. He's auditing their course curriculums. Like this is
it's an interesting threshold argument. I'll give you my answer. $0 to any university in this country. There's my solution. These are Marxist breeding grounds. These are Marxist breeding grounds that are creating a tier of citizens that think that I and people that I value most are a blight.
The cutting edge of research.
Please let me finish. They think that people like me in rural America are a blight. They say that we cling to our guns and Bibles. I no longer want to fund the enemy. They should be forced to lose their tax dollars and live off their billion-dollar endowments that they could continue to fund. Why won't they take their endowment to fund this important cancer research? Why won't they if it's so important?
I mean, I don't know what their budgeting is. I can't tell you what they spend all their money on.
They have double-digit billions in endowments.
Okay.
So why aren't they using that for the cancer research?
I'm sure some of it is being used for the.
Okay,
I don't know what their
we don't have to worry about.
Used for,
sounds good. They'll use their endowment for
the saying that like, as long as they have some budget left, like no harm done.
Right, because the money's
things are earmarked for different things. And again, it seems like you want to engineer culture through government policy. That's
exactly what the status quo was before Trump. Engineering culture through government policy and sending all this money.
Governments preventing colleges from hiring conservatives?
No, but they were intentionally funding universities that weren't doing that.
Does this policy not have a chilling effect that would prevent Harvard from hiring progressive professors now?
Good. That's what the status quo is.
You're just saying, like, okay, it's a good thing that it's happening. Okay.
Well, I think that it should. It'll have a
I just
status
think that's
quo.
bad.
It'll have the policy. Hopefully, if it's accepted. By the way, I don't know that. I would have to read specifically. The things I was reading on it, it was like, we want to open up your books and make sure that your admissions policies are no longer violating the Civil Rights Act and things like that.
Admissions was part of it. Part of it was also professors and curriculums of what they're teaching,
Right,
which
because
to me is a massive overstep.
I don't think so, because I think that we have the right. For example, if there were allegations that federal dollars were going to Hillsdale, which by the way they're not. Hillsdale is one of the colleges that doesn't take federal funds. But if there are allegations that was going there and part of their curriculum was white supremacy, do you think our tax dollars should go there?
I mean, what are the tax dollars funding? The white supremacy curriculum or like medical research?
Doesn't matter. The money's going to be fungible. So if we said, if Hillsdale said, listen, trust us, because we're getting hundreds of millions of dollars from the federal government, we're spending that on everything but the white supremacy stuff. But now our money, we're able to finance into the white supremacy. You'd say that's fine.
If they're funding like cutting edge cancer research,
Sure.
then sure, yeah, those people
think
don't have
you're full
anything
of
to do with
shit.
the curriculums.
I don't think you would think that. I think you
The
would say
medical
we should not.
departments are not even like in the same organization as like the school's curriculum, the people that set the curriculum administrators.
I
They're totally
I
separate.
don't think that that's. I think that even if you somehow would make that argument, I don't know you enough. I think that there would be an uproar if there was federal tax dollars that was going.
If they were
to the school.
going to the curriculum that's teaching white supremacy, yeah.
Again, I'm unimpressed by this argument because I understand that the money's fungible, and so we should not be
A lot of these
rewarding.
dollars are earmarked.
We should not be rewarding universities that are preaching hatred and training Marxists that are antithetical to my way of life. I should not be forced to fund that because, trust us, dude, that money's only going to cancer research. That's the same argument. And by the way, how would we know that's true if the government's not allowed to look into it?
They can look into it, sure.
Okay, so you have no problem with Trump saying, like, we want to look into everything that's happening in this cancer research.
Yeah, I have no problem with government audits, but Trump seems to have a problem with it because he fired all these inspectors general when he came into office who were actually identifying like $93 billion in waste.
Next question. Are you 100% positive that the money Harvard's getting is only going to cancer research?
I couldn't say it with like 100% certainty, no.
I would say that there's probably a near 100% certainty.
I actually believe $7 billion of the $9 billion goes to cancer research.
Okay, so then $2 billion is going to other stuff. What's that going to?
I wouldn't know off the top of my head. It could be other important stuff as well. Like Harvard is an elite educational institution.
Why can't, again, if this stuff's so important, they could use their wealthy endowments. They could increase tuition. It's some of the wealthiest, most privileged Americans that get to go there. They could pay a little more to go there.
If you're saying you don't want to directly fund like sources of like political speech, that's a different argument than I don't want to fund these educational institutions.
I do not want to fund institutions that are antithetical and want to destroy my way of life.
And you
I
don't
have
care
the right
what
to say I have the
repercussions
right
that
to say
has.
that. And I hope that what Trump does, I hope that he listens to me because I've been preaching this. All of this argument that Doge can't cut this, Doge can't do that, they're not allowed to do this. What Trump needs to do is take every dollar of funding that goes to any NGO or whatever and redirect it to Christian, culturally right-wing agendas. So, for example, if there's $100 million earmarked to fight HIV, he should send every dollar of that to Orthodox Christians that preach abstinence. That's what he should do.
Wouldn't you want to evaluate the efficacy of, legally speaking, you might have a point there that sure, like probably he has a discretion to choose a conservative, maybe not Christian, but culturally conservative. Sure, the executive has some discretion with certain funds.
What do you mean not Christian? The Catholic charities get all sorts of money for NGOs to bring in illegals.
Okay, sure. The point that I'm trying to make here is that when it comes to like sending the funding somewhere else, that's one thing. Doge is trying to just cut some of these funds, which directly goes against the power of the purse, no?
No. What goes against the spirit of the power of the purse is as follows, right? And if the power of the purse doesn't
say, Empowerment and Control Act,
if the law says something like that, or if the first off, Congress has largely abdicated their responsibility, including the power of the purse. What they instead do is pass these 1,000 pages, continuing resolutions or omnibus bills at the end of the year at the deadline, and none of them read it. Most of the money that's sent is sort of discretionary, right? So it'll say something like this, $500 million for cancer research, right? It doesn't say $500 million to this department in Harvard, right? So the problem is what happens is the funding isn't what's the big problem. The problem is the bureaucracy that gets to choose exactly how that funding is spent. That's the problem. And so, for example,
you can do audits, that's fine.
So, for example, we see that USAID funds things like the National Endowment of Democracy or Voice of America, right? You agree with that? They do that, right? Some of the things that the National Endowment of Democracy is doing is pressuring Poland to lock up their former president that was a populist. In part, the reason that they're suggesting doing that is, are you ready for this? This is from their own writings. Their reason was because those populists suggested during the pandemic mail-in voting, which would be rife with corruption. In other words, our money is going to a government institution that is saying that Poland should lock up populist right-wingers because they wanted mail-in voting. Meanwhile, back home, NGOs pressured social media companies to shut up people in this country that wanted mail-in voting or that were against mail-in voting. That's the sort of shit that I'm talking about. And when we try to revoke that and say, this is such like ridiculous, it's literally completely financing 180-degree antithetical to my interest. The argument I'm giving is, but what about HIV? What about cancer research? I'm sorry, I'm not persuaded.
This is another example where you can list specific expenditures of the U.S. government that I would agree with you are dumb. Like I think one was like DEI in Serbia. That's obviously dumb. I'm not saying there's no waste here. But again, I don't believe the Trump administration is even addressing waste in good faith, because the first thing Trump did when he came into office is illegally firing the inspectors general. And the inspectors general in 2023 alone identified $93 billion in waste, which is more than Musk has identified so far. And again,
what was illegal about the firing? That he was supposed to give 30 days?
30-day notice to Congress.
I don't give a shit.
Okay, so then a lot of what you're saying is like, this might be against rule of law or illegal, but like, who really gives a fuck? Okay, fair enough. At least you're honest about that.
I mean, on the grand scheme of things, he's totally allowed to fire him. He just had to give him 30 days.
Sure, with cause, I'm pretty sure as well.
Is there any evidence?
Also, by the way, but he didn't even replace them. So it's like, what was the point of this?
Well, because he felt that person wasn't doing their job and articulating waste.
Then why didn't he fire them with cause or like investigate their performance? People are losing government jobs that are like top performers in their agencies.
I don't care, right? Again, I'll go back to the debt spending. The debt spending was unsustainable. We, for years, have had this debt spiraling out of control.
Please change the budget, not on the executive branch to fire people.
Please, let me finish. So we've had this spiraling out of control. And then when we finally get someone in there, it's like, this shit needs to stop. We need to do something. People go, oh, there were other ways to do it. We could have did this and that. No, the truth is the people in the status quo in the Republican and the Democratic Party were going to continue this massive out of control spending, which would have led to things like inflation, which directly hurts the poor and working class. You're not arguing for law and order if you're supporting Democrats, because they've been more blatant violations of law and order, including pressuring social media companies to censor
over the course of this conversation. I have not blindly defended a single Democrat, whereas every time I've brought an instance to you of Trump breaking the law, you're like, who really gives a fuck? I don't like the libs.
That's not true, right? I've talked about when there were things that I thought that were warranted that maybe were against the law or that I thought were directionally. But again, if you remember the topic of this debate, and I know we've run afoul, which I don't give a shit because I've had a lot of fun, and I hope that Jake and the audience has enjoyed it as well. But the original topic of whether or not Trump's been a success, a little unfair to me because we seem to be talking topics that are more skewed to criticisms of Trump, but no problem. But again, if you go back to that idea, if it's comparative to previous things, you're making a bunch of criticisms about Trump, about like authoritarianism and stuff that's basically baked into the status quo, that we've seen Democrats do more direct abuses. Kudos to you for saying, hey, I didn't support those Democrat abuses anyways. But I think the benefit of Trump, that the status quo was not sustainable, right? That he's taking actions that I think are beneficial when I talked about things like ending DEI, when I talked about the border security, when I talked about things like, actually trying to do something about the massive spending and, the status quo not being sustainable. I don't think you're winning on any of those arguments.
Taxing and spending, but I mean,
I just think that you're making arguments that are just like Trump's bad, like Obama was.
No, how are we going for time, fellas? Do you guys need to be out at any point soon? Because there was one last topic I wanted to get into. How you guys going?
I'm good to go.
I'm fine. I'm having a good time.
I think that the global reserve currency is an interesting one because from both sides, there's an interesting point to be made here. Like from the Republican side, the people who support tariffs and Trump's policies in that regard, they could say that it's going to strengthen the economy, strengthen the GDP, and it's going to strengthen the US dollar eventually. But from the left, you guys could say that it's actually weakening the US's stance on the global stage. China might take over, etc. So in terms of the global reserve currency and the effects of Trump's policy on the US and its global standing, where do you guys stand on that? And I'll kick it to Adam first for this one.
Yeah, I think like there are certain actions you can take that might threaten your global reserve currency status, although it's much harder than some people think to actually get off the US dollar as a global reserve currency. Like it would be a very, very long, drawn out process. Like certain contracts are already signed, certain deals are already made in US dollars. So like this type of paradigm shift would probably take decades if it was to happen. I do think it's maybe more likely when you antagonize economically every other country with things like tariffs. I think Rob mentioned earlier the gold standard, which as far as I understand it, maybe I've been indoctrinated with my economics degree or something, but having a gold standard inevitably leads to deflation, because then you have a limited supply of money and eventually it's not going to keep pace with economic growth. That's why you sort of need to have fiat currency and a Federal Reserve. But that's sort of my 2 cents on it.
Well, as far as a gold standard, it would also be buttress things like cryptocurrency and things like Bitcoin, which I think would be sort of more ability to be elastic. But there's a reason that gold has always been the world reserve currency, because it's something that is finite and it's something that doesn't have practical uses in ways that like other things like other precious metals would be able to do. So this is why gold was always sort of the reserve currency that was used. It may take a long while. I can't guarantee this would happen. And let me completely concede that I'm not an expert on this, right? But I think that I'm directionally right on this. But I fully welcome people in the chat being like, well, Rob doesn't. I'm telling you, I'm a redneck that works home healthcare. But I think that there is a fundamental problem with the United States and what their export is. What do you think the big U.S. export is, Adam?
Depends to where.
I think it's dollars. I think that what the
Sure,
United States is exporting around the world is dollars, right? And I think that that fundamentally caused a problem in the United States, which was that it hollowed out the manufacturing sector and it sort of hollowed out the middle class. And what it's done is incentivized sort of people getting into financial markets, which aren't really creating things of value. So instead of like manufacturing vehicles or manufacturing ships or manufacturing ammunition, manufacturing steel, things that we would ship around the world, we're just sending these dollars. And so now talented people back here at home, you could go to school for 8 years to be an engineer, or you could go to school for 4 years to learn how to manage a hedge fund. That hedge fund isn't creating material things. It's just switching pools of money around. As the financial sector grows and grows and grows because of this, what happens is the people that aren't in that game, that aren't playing that game, like blue collar workers, they're increasingly getting left behind. And that's why we see that as the GDP goes up and up and up and stock market goes up and up and up, wealth disparity is also doing that. There's certainly claims that people have to wealth disparity that aren't traditionally in the blue collar. For example, you could say that people that suffered through Jim Crow, et cetera, like that, maybe were never part of this middle class and didn't have opportunities to get in there. But there's a large swath of people that were in that middle class that were doing things like in my state of Pennsylvania, working at steel mills, working at kilns, et cetera, that lost their opportunity because the United States decided that their number one export was going to be dollars. We've also then increased a situation where the United States used to be a net investor in other countries. So we owned assets, land, etc., in other countries, investments in other countries. Now it is massively gone the other way. And we have foreign nations, sometimes hostile foreign nations, that have massive investment in the United States. This is not sustainable. And you hear people like J.D. Vance, who in 2023 was talking to the Federal Reserve chairman, talking about like, what has the United States gained? What have the people of the United States gained by the U.S. being the world reserve currency? He believes if this doesn't change, that we're inevitably going to get into a spiral where there will be incredible wealth from the people at the top of the United States, but the bottom will just be a poor working class that will be malleable, which will increasingly import foreigners from other countries to compete with this low-skilled labor, which will further diminish that of the life ability, what's the word I'm looking for, the sort of quality of life for the citizens of this country.
Okay, so I agree with you that the working class has largely been hollowed out, but I mean, most of the evidence shows that that's because of two reasons. Number one is declining union membership, and number two is automation. Even a lot of these jobs come back to the US, they're going to be automated jobs. Maybe people can work, helping the arm do the job or whatever. Like, it might create some sort of like secondary jobs, even if it is automated. But like, this idea that globalization is the primary cause of manufacturing being hollowed out is not really borne out by the data that I've seen. Maybe there's other data you've seen. When we talk about global ownership of like our bonds and stuff, I mean, there's two ways to look at it. One way to look at it is like, if you want your bond to be profitable, then the US being successful is now in your interest if you are invested in the US. Now, I agree, when countries like China own a lot of our bonds, if this trade war continues to escalate, they could just dump a bunch of US bonds to get back at us, which would be very dangerous. So there, I think there's a fair point. When it comes to broadly our Federal Reserve, the Federal Reserve has two jobs. It's a dual mandate system. They change the federal funds rate to ensure that they balance inflation at 2% and maintain the natural unemployment rate in the country. That is what they do. If you have a gold standard, sure, gold is valuable, but I see gold the same way as crypto, more of an asset, because you do not want to have a currency that is limited in supply. Because when you have a currency that's limited in supply, you always get deflation, always, without question. Because if the currency is limited in supply and economic growth is hypothetically not limited in supply, eventually that delta gets to be too much, and you start to see horrible issues with wages, economic contraction, people refusing to invest in anything. Because, for example, when you have deflation, why would anyone invest in a risky stock or bond when they can just hold on to their dollars, and tomorrow the dollar's worth more now. So there's so many issues that come from having a gold standard. There's issues when it comes to having other countries owning our bonds that I'd agree with. But in the context of the Trump administration and his sort of take on this, he's trying to strip away independence from the Federal Reserve, which I think is insane for any president to do that. I do not want the president of either party to be deciding federal funds rates and liquidity requirements for other banks and how much we're insuring other banks. When it comes to, like, you also mentioned, like, we have a debt crisis. That is true. Part of the way you address that is to raise taxes and bring in more revenues. And then if you spend government money in productive ways like infrastructure, it actually boosts our GDP. So in some cases, taxing more and spending more in specific cases actually improves our debt to GDP ratio. What Trump is doing right now is he's cutting some of the most efficient parts of our government. The inspectors general, the ROI on that is for every $1 you spend, you get 26 back. The IRS, every $1 you spend, you get $7 back. And Trump is targeting these agencies. The IRS has already predicted that because of Trump's cuts to the IRS, purely because they can't audit enough people, we're going to lose $500 billion in revenue, not by cutting taxes or raising taxes, just based on IRS tax enforcement. So I think overall, monetary policy and fiscal policy, the Trump administration is completely incoherent. And also just antagonizing other countries with these tariffs does not put us in a great situation going forward in terms of other countries wanting to work with us instead of China.
Okay, so real quick, I'll say this, right? I think that the idea, like, there are certain problems that would happen with a fiat currency versus a stable currency that's backed by something. So, of course, there's going to be this constant inflation versus deflation. I could talk about the horrors of inflation, much of which is disproportionately harming the poor and working class that we saw during the Biden administration, where depending on the metrics you use, sometimes year over year was about 12%. But I don't have to tell anyone listening this because you buy groceries, and if you live in the United States, you know what's going on. So the idea that it's like, well, we can't change from that and we just have to continue this path of the status quo, and the things that he's suggesting that could possibly get us out of that are just things that have been done in the status quo. Basically, it's just a criticism of tax cuts. No, trust us. If we keep spending, that money being spent will go to good ways. He says, well, for example, if we cut from the IRS itself says that'll be really bad. I'm not surprised. My prediction is 99.999% of any institution that you threaten to cut funding from would release an internal report that said, if you cut our funding, it'll be harmful for you. So I'm not surprised by that. We also see that the IRS not only is ideologically once more targeting groups like conservative groups, but they're more likely to target actually like people that aren't able to fight back. So it allows loopholes because the people that are the wealthiest that maybe the IRS would be going after actually are able to fight and have the loopholes and know the things that are going on with that. Actually decreasing taxes, like Trump did in his first term, was beneficial because one, it ensures that more industry comes here. Second, even the poor and working class, despite the propaganda that you saw, benefit from that, which meant that they had more money to spend, which was actually a better way of allowing free market principles that are always going to be more efficient in the types of businesses that they're creating. He already said that the problem with the infrastructure and the massive spending under Joe Biden was that there were all these regulations, et cetera, et cetera. Right. In an ideal world where you could say, well, I would remove all of these things that I think are barriers, maybe then you could say that these certain types of spending would be good. We don't live in that ideal world. There is no politician other than Trump that's talking about getting rid of large of these burdensome regulations. And certainly the Democrats aren't doing that. And they're actually in favor of creating more regulations, as we saw under Joe Biden. Trump famously, for every one regulation that they brought in his term, he cut 10 regulations. And so one of the things that we can see was like the court case with the I'm not even going to talk about it. There's a bunch of regulations that were basically being created because we had a law that basically said that these bureaucracies themselves got to interpret the law and enforce the law. And do you know the case I'm talking about? What's that? Yes, the Enron case, right?
Enron doctrine,
yeah. So the Chevron doctrine case that was got reviewed, these things will be positive, and those are coming from a more conservative sort of Trumpian lean on those sorts of things. The last thing I'll say is I just have a question for you, Adam. Like,
yeah.
If there was no change to the status quo and things continued in the direction they were going, do you think that we would have continued to see the United States decline vis-a-vis its power position versus countries like China?
Economically or militarily?
Well, we'll just do economically. Is China going to keep getting a bigger portion of the pie?
By decline, I mean, what China does is to some extent going to be not fully independent, but they're going to make their decisions based on what's good for them. Sure. Are you asking if I think that Democrats would have caused the U.S. to like economically?
No. Let me say. Do you think? Let's say there's a percentage of global wealth, right? Do you think that China's been getting more?
Oh, I don't believe it's a zero-sum game.
Well, that's fair. Right? Like you could say like the whole world's worth 100 trillion, so we could make it 200 trillion. That's fine. I'm not arguing that. But would the percentage of that total wealth that that China has, whether it be through GDP, whether it be through exports, etc., do you think it's going to continue to increase in the status quo?
It would depend if we won our sort of economic war with them, but there seems to be bipartisan consensus against China. Now, like Democrats and Republicans are both pretty hawkish on China when it comes to economics.
So I'll just say real quick, and then I promise I'll let you talk. I think that it's clearly that China would. That the status quo was that China is rising incredibly fast, particularly since they were invited into the WTO. I think that was likely to continue. And so I think a lot of the calculus, I know this is sort of getting back to the tariff discussion, but it also hinges on this sort of world reserve currency thing. I think a lot of the calculus that you see from people like Bessonnet and JD Vance that are really running this show, in my opinion, is that the United States will never be in a better bargaining position than right now. That if the status quo continued, the United States' bargaining position would shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink till inevitably, maybe 30, 40 years from now, the amount of bonds that would be owned by places like China and how reliant we would be for simple manufacturing that are important for people's day-to-day life would have been such that they had such an incredible bargaining position over us that they would have been basically controlling all of the political decisions that we made. So now is the key time to try a radical departure. And that's one of the major reasons that I think, despite a declining stock market in the short term, any sort of radical departure would have uncertainty and have short-term losses and things like the stock market. And so I think that I applaud Trump at least for trying something that's different, because the status quo, as you've already admitted, is not sustainable and is not working for the poor and working class in this country.
Okay, so a few things here. I wrote down some of the points you made because I want to address all of them. So when it comes to China entering the WTO, I'd want to know what specifically you think changed in our trade relationship as a result of that. That was negative. Again, I'm not going to dispute that might be the case, but what specifically changed when they joined the WTO? Because we were already importing a lot from China before some of these doomsday trade deals that took place. When it comes to just China in general having leverage over us, one issue that I have with some of the MAGA takes on China is like, why are we not learning from them and doing what works? When they subsidize their local industry, when they build a lot of housing, when they provide good social services, why are we not like learning from that rather than pointing at them?
When they put on big tariffs.
Huh?
When they place big tariffs.
I'm talking about subsidies.
But you just said, why not learn from China? Does China not have
learn
large
from
tariffs?
what works? I mean, a lot of what China does doesn't work. I'm sure you'd both agree, right? So like when it comes to things like subsidies, everyone complains China's dumping all their products. How about we start dumping our products too and subsidizing it? That's just one aspect of it. When you talk about the IRS, you say, obviously, any agency is going to say that this is going to lose us money. Then don't take the IRS's word for it. Independent analyses have shown that for every $1 you spend on the IRS, you get a return that ranges anywhere from like $5 to $12. Because it turns out, even if you don't raise tax rates, just having more audits taking place, especially on wealthier people who are using loopholes to avoid paying taxes, brings in more revenue. I would say whether or not you want to raise. Say again?
That's not what happened. Like, do you think that the IRS pre-Joe Biden hiring a bunch of them, at least the data I was reading back then, was showing the people that were most likely to be audited were like middle-class people?
My understanding is the people that Trump is hiring work in the auditing divisions that specifically target like wealthier people. You can fact check me on that maybe. Obviously, I don't want people that are middle and working class to be audited, but a lot of the big bucks are not coming from like the random guy who lives in a suburb or lives in an apartment.
Yeah, but
a lot of it.
Certainly a disproportional amount's coming from the extremely
Why
wealthy,
not just enforce the existing tax code to its full extent? I'm not even talking about raising taxes. Well, it brings in revenue.
Well, who says that? Right. But the problem is, right, the people that are able to find the loopholes, and those are the wealthy. And I could be wrong, but my reading back when Joe Biden was suggesting hiring a bunch of new IRS agents, that the problem was that they were like, well, we need all these agents because all of these wealthy people have loopholes. But then when you looked, it's like, well, the problem is for the IRS, it's so much easier to go after the people that don't have access to those loopholes. So what happens is, if you're a good agent there, here's what's likely to happen. You could spend months and months and months on one case for a really wealthy guy, hoping that you get a windfall, or you could spend each day going after 5 people that are in the middle class, and you end up making more money by going after them because you're guaranteed to win and get that. So at the top level, these people are paying more they're paying more in taxes at the top level. Yeah. That's certainly true. But when it comes to the need for an auditor, I don't think that those auditors are doing a great job going after the people at the top.
Maybe you've seen different numbers than I've seen, but every single independent analysis I've seen is that when you give the IRS more funding, they go after the biggest sources of money to bring in the most money. If you want to say there's different facts in that, people can Google that and figure it out itself. There's extensively researched the returns in funding the IRS. When we talk about also, the reason I oppose tax cuts is because anytime you talk about cutting taxes, the ultimate question is is this $1 of tax cuts better spent in the public sector or the private sector? And we have numbers on this from the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. And also, this is just basic economics. There's something called a multiplier in economics, right? If you cut taxes, for every $1 in taxes, the multiplier is how much does that affect GDP? Same with government spending. When you look at things like corporate tax cuts, the highest end multiplier on corporate tax cuts, meaning for every $1 you spend on it, how much economic growth do you get, is 0.4. So every $1 you spend on corporate tax cuts, you get 40 cents of economic growth. Switch that over to infrastructure spending, 0.4 is the low end of the estimate, and the high end is 2.2x.
I don't believe that. I think
Anyone
those numbers are fraudulent.
Sure. Anyone here who studied macroeconomics can tell you this isn't just like an empirical question.
But wait a minute. You just said when we talked about...
I can explain why that's the case.
But I just real quick, because you seem to have contradicted something you said earlier. When I brought up, for example, the Biden infrastructure bill, the $47 billion on the road, you're like, well, the problem with that was regulation. But presumably the studies you're talking about are already factoring in those regulations.
Yeah, it's high impact when you're shovel ready and you're actually building it. That's when
When's the last time that happened?
Because hold on, that's when the money is being spent. Right now, a lot of that money is in limbo. It's not even being spent. It hasn't been divvied out to the states.
Right. So what happens is a lot of times what happens, like, did you hear... Who was it? Ezra Klein that was talking about Jon Stewart about this rural broadband? Did you see that?
When you said earlier Democrats aren't moving towards this, I disagree because Ezra Klein is picking up a lot of steam with the Democratic establishment when it comes to supply side, more like funding and getting rid of regulations.
So the problem is the way the Democrats have set it up with these regulations, it's not just that Ezra is saying, yep, this big pool of money is still waiting there. He's talking about millions being spent at every step that accomplish nothing.
No, he's talking about the hurdles you have to jump through in terms of approvals from different interest groups.
Didn't he also talk about the millions that were being spent every step of the way while that's occurring?
On the regulation.
Correct. So the idea that it's like, well, if we would just
does that discredit the idea of infrastructure, though?
Yeah, it discredits the way of infrastructure being spent and being shovel ready in the way you're talking. If we just say, the problem would be solved if we just spend $100 billion on building roads and bridges. But the problem is when we spend that money, we don't get any roads or bridges for 10 years. How's that stimulating?
America has the capacity to be like leading in the world in terms of our roads and bridges and ports, internet access.
Why aren't they? We spend tons of money on it.
Way too much regulatory oversight, not just on private sector. The government over-regulates itself in terms of getting approvals for permits and building and having to go through a million different hurdles where the state government, local government, federal government are all working together to draw these maps.
I totally agree. That's why I don't believe the data that says actually, as it is, the spending as we do it right now is so much more prudent. No, what it's saying is once that actually processes through all of these hurdles,
I'm saying let's actually process that and get to that point, and that's much more. Okay, let's say, for example, that these hurdles didn't exist and it was easy to build. The entire idea here is that when you cut taxes, you have no way of knowing how many of those dollars are actually going to be spent versus saved versus repatriated somewhere else. When the government spends money on infrastructure, you know for a fact they're going to hire contractors. Those contractors then have to buy materials. There's always going to be a greater multiplier on government spending than on tax cuts because government spending is inherently going to be accomplishing a certain goal in the immediate,
let's test
whereas
that.
tax cuts can be saved.
Let's test that. How'd the PPP loans do? How'd the stimmy checks do?
What do you mean, how'd they do?
How'd they do? That was government spending, so that must have been a massive boon, correct?
They boosted aggregate demand, sure.
Okay, so what really happened was there was like hundreds of billions of dollars of fraud. Okay. And it led to one of the largest, real quick, it led to one of the largest transfers of wealth from the poor and working class to the upper class that we've seen in decades. That's what happened.
Stimulus checks?
What's that?
Or the PPP loans?
In general, the amount of government spending that occurred during the lockdowns.
It's like you have to draw a distinction between the stimulus checks and the loans to big businesses, though.
Well, the loans weren't just to big businesses, were they?
And again, if fraud took place, I think we're on the same team here. Prosecute the fraud. Like you're bringing up,
but you're sort of advocating from this utopian's perspective when you're like, yeah. The way
I'm advocating from a reformist perspective.
But like, for example, you say, sure, the way
China, utopia, they build stuff all the time.
You say like, yeah, sure. What we should do is we should just do the spending and it'll be good. But yeah, the way it's played out as we've done that is that it doesn't work because of all these regulations. And then, the PPP loans and that government spending, that was all good, except that like 20% of it was fraud. So yeah, we should go after the fraud, but still that's good. What I'm telling you is this occurs all the time. You say just spend, give the government more power. And increasingly when we see the government spending, debt goes up, wealth disparity increases, inflation increases, poor and working class pay the brunt of it.
You did the exact same thing for the tariffs where you said, sure, some of the stuff Trump did with tariffs might have been done, but I think ideally the tariffs can be used this way. And I took your argument at face value. I didn't hold you to account for procedural delays or hurdles that are faced in practical reality by the sitting administration. Like I've said, I'm critical of regulation that prevents infrastructure from being built. California was supposed to have high-speed rail a million years ago. They don't have anything yet. But does that mean I now don't want high-speed rail, or that I want to reform the system through which it's built? We did an interstate highway system. We had a New Deal. We've built a lot of stuff before. We have the ability to do it. China is no utopia. China has, in some cases, breathtaking, amazing infrastructure. And I think if you want to, win against China on the world stage, part of that is maybe saying we have the best roads, the best bridges, the best schools. We actually take care of our workers. We have strong unions. And a lot of that comes from government intervention and fiscal stimulus. Is there fraud? Is there overcorrection? Yes, but that is not going to exist as some kind of counterfactual to invalidate the entire theory that the government can stimulate the economy and direct economic growth to maximize public welfare.
I disagree. One, I think that we could, with the insane amount of growth that we've had with the government, and the problem is we have you correct me if I'm wrong, I believe we have the largest government when it comes to people that are employed in the history of the world. Is that true?
Sure.
It is blown out of proportion. It's a similar problem you see at universities, where as more and more spending gets put into it, what happens is it's not that they're hiring more professors, it's they're hiring more administrators. Same thing.
I agree. We have a bureaucracy problem in the country broadly, corporate and public.
So what happens is, we have to look at how things apply practically. When you say, well, look, you said that about tariffs, I don't like some of the way they're applying. What I'm saying is certainly there's room to criticism. If these tariffs would go into effect, or even the way they're being suggested, we could talk about the pros and cons of it. I think that it's better than the status quo, though, because I've seen the status quo as a failure, and you concede we have no idea what the outcome of Trump's tariff plan will be. I think that it'll end up slightly better for the United States because there will be negotiated deals.
I would bet money that it wouldn't, but
okay,
I don't know
we'll
for
see.
sure.
I don't think it'll be as good as Trump's saying, but I think it'll be. But I'm not sitting here with 100% confidence, but I applaud him for trying something because I think the status quo wasn't. When I'm talking about the sort of spendings you're talking about, we're not talking about hypothetical. We're talking about, okay, these sorts of things have been occurring year after year after year. We spend more and more money, our government, including on things like infrastructure, and we can see the results. And the results aren't panning out.
Great.
The results aren't panning out the way. So if you're saying, no, I'm cheering for a politician that wasn't and didn't have a chance to win, and this is the politician that I want, and here are the proposed regulations, that's fine. You could make those sorts of arguments. I think that what we see, though, there is a proclivity amongst government that the more you spend, it becomes self-fulfilling and self-grows, and that means that it's going to have more and more money, more and more regulations. Yes, things were different in the 50s with the interstate highway system. We can't even build high-speed rail now, and it's going to take radical change. And from a departure of a Democratic Party that wants to spend more, the best chance of infrastructure spending that would be useful would be under a Trump-type presidency.
There are Democrats that are doing what I've said. Josh Shapiro was able to rebuild some bridge or some shit in 2 weeks because he went over all the regulatory hurdles and declared an emergency. So there are case studies. And again, even with the infrastructure bill, one of the freeways that I drive very frequently on my way to boxing practice was repaved 2 years ago. It is now the smoothest freeway anywhere near me. That's anecdotal, sure, but I'm saying But
do you understand what I'm saying? I'm not suggesting don't build roads. I'm suggesting when you say the alternative to cutting taxes is building roads, that's what are you
the alternative that I would like to see is reforming government, reforming bureaucracy. And again, even when you talk about, I agree, there's bureaucracy in academia, in the corporate world, and in the government. But Trump is not going in with some fine-tooth comb to figure out who's doing important work and who isn't. He is sometimes firing the people that oversee our nuclear stockpiles. He's firing people that are administering treatment for tuberculosis, and 11,000 people have died in the time since it's been paused. Bring up valid procedural issues, but then the solution given is instead of a scalpel, let's use a chainsaw or a hammer, run it over with a bullet.
It's the oldest argument in the book. No one does anything for decades. The problem gets exacerbated, and then when someone comes in and says we're at an emergency, we have to make radical change, these people say, oh, we would have done it with a scalpel. No, they wouldn't have. Thank God that Trump's at least trying to have radical change. Will that result in some things being terminated that were actually net beneficial? Sure, but the alternative is worse, and we don't have time to sit here and go, let's go through every program with a scalpel. We don't have time. The debt is spiraling out of control. People, the working class in this country, are suffering. The United States is going to continue. The United States is going to continue to lose its bargaining chip. No, instead of raising revenue, I think we should cut spending.
Yeah, but that's going to decrease the deficit. But the debt is how do we pay that down? We have to raise revenue for that.
Well, if we cut spending, then a bigger proportion of the revenue we had would go to paying down the debt.
Okay, but like realistically, with the numbers we're talking about, especially when the Republican budget is going to have like a $4 trillion or $5 trillion deficit added, so I'm sure you would probably say they should at least be cutting more than what they're cutting
Yes,
in the current
it's
plan.
valid criticism of the Republicans. Absolutely, they always
Okay.
talk about being fiscally responsible and then spend out the wazoo. Yep.
Okay, so my question to you, I guess, we probably just have like a very fundamental disagreement on like basic economics. Like, do you support like you said you care about income inequality? Am I incorrect in hearing that from you?
Yes, I think it's something that should
But
be
do you
addressed.
think we should cut corporate tax rates or like income taxes in the top brackets, like people making over 600K as individuals?
I'll be honest. Like, I have to think about it heavily. I am not
Fair.
predisposed. I'm more now in favor of sort of a progressive tax rate than I would have been 5 years ago, where I was more libertarian adjacent, right?
Okay.
And so I'm definitely open to that, right? I think that one of the things you said has some truth that rang to it. Was like, it's not even a matter of creating new taxes. It might be a matter of enforcing laws that are on the books and sort of closing sorts of loopholes that occur. I think that probably we'd be better with a different tax system altogether, maybe eliminating the income tax. But right now, I think that an argument that people need to deal with is like, there are like, what is it, like the carried income tax or something like that?
Carried interest
Yeah,
loophole, yeah.
there are people that are paying less than your average Joe Schmo worker when it comes to percentage, and I
Yeah.
find that to be absurd.
And a
I
lot of
think-
billionaires, they take out loans leveraged against their stocks. They don't have to pay any tax on that, and they're spending it for whatever.
But would you agree with this? Back when people tout like, well, we used to have a higher like corporate tax rate back in like what, the 60s, the 70s.
Oh, we had like 90% top.
But no one paid that, right? You acknowledge.
And also, it was like we were heavily industrial because it was post World War II, so
Right.
it's not analogous.
So the problem is like to say like, well, look how things were when we had this 90% tax rate. Things were different because we were industrial.
90 is way too high.
And no one paid that. I agree. Right. So
Yeah.
like the idea that you see from these radical lefties, it's like, well, anybody,
Very
no
small
one,
minority, though, I will say.
no one should be a billionaire. Like that's bullshit. Like that's just a stupid argument.
Like
right.
my entire economic thesis is I don't care about lowering the ceiling. I just want to raise the floor. I don't care about rich people. I care more about working class people, having unions, having stable jobs, access to healthcare, good education, good roads and bridges. I think that outcome is nonpartisan. I think everyone wants that outcome. The question of how do you get there, I think it's more borne out by when you look at things like the New Deal and places like China with industrial policy, subsidies, and taxing the wealthy, not to an insane amount. I think maybe a top marginal tax rate of like 47% on income over like $3 million a year. It's not that crazy. It's still less than half.
It's something I'm willing. No, listen, I'm not an economic expert. It's something I'm willing to listen to. What I do know is the current system isn't working. We need a radical change. I think Trump's doing that. I think that our allies have taken advantage of us in many ways, as have our enemies. I think that the negotiating tactic he's using, that you see sort of his art of the deal, which is you make the big ask that seems ridiculous, and then you
What is the ask?
The big ask is the tariffs that he's putting out there.
But like when we say this is a negotiating tactic, like what is the outcome he's trying to achieve? Because he's also tariffed countries we have a surplus with. So it's
Right.
like,
I think
what is
he's,
the-
I think the outcome, I think that ultimately what he's trying to do is have like a new Bretton Woods agreement. I think that he's sort of posturing like we're willing to tariff the shit out of everyone, and we're going to claim the reason is we want like a zero trade deficit. That's the reason, not just with particular countries, but around the world. So would he be okay with like we have a 5% deficit with Canada, but a 5% surplus with UK? Maybe, right? But I think ultimately the goal that he's trying to issue is go way further with tariffs than he actually want. Force countries to be like, look, he's serious. The United States is in the best bargaining position that it will be right now. And so we're going to have to come to the table and we're going to have some sort of agreements. And those agreements would be one, like to stop trade barriers that we see for places like that are our adversaries or our enemies. Second, to try to have more specific business arrangements that would encircle China. Right. So try to get people to stop engaging with business with China and more with the United States. And then third, I think to have individual bilateral agreements with countries on specific deals. Like we agree to buy so much of your rare earths if you agree to buy so much of our oil, etc. That's what I think ultimately his goal is.
Okay, just on a quick note, I think multilateral trade is typically better than bilateral trade, but some of the main points you brought up, like specifically like trade deficits are not inherently a bad thing. Like we have trade deficits sometimes with very poor countries that just produce stuff that we consume because we're a richer country.
I agree with that.
We consume more stuff. I have a trade deficit with my local grocery store because I buy from them. They don't buy from me. It can be an issue, again, with places like China when there's national security involved. But as a broad economic matter, trade deficits are not inherently bad. When we talk about,
but can I say real quick? I don't disagree with that, but I'm saying that's Trump's starting negotiation position. He's saying that, right? So if you're right now, if you're Australia, might you not be thinking like, holy shit, even though there's a surplus, which I'm taking your word for that, but I think that sounds right, that the United States has a surplus with Australia. You're like, what the hell is this 10% tariff about? their explanation is one of two things. This guy's just fucking insane, or he's trying to have a zero trade deficit around the world, right? And if that means that, okay,
But
he
then
wants
wouldn't
to
he give
increase
preferential treatment to countries like Australia and the UK instead of treating them with the same amount of tariff as countries that we have a deficit with?
He probably would eventually, but I think that his starting negotiation tactic would be, we'll be even willing to go after you, so we need better deals.
That just seems like there's no rhyme or reason behind the tariffs. And it lends credibility to the point that tariffs are actually the end goal, and we have this external revenue service.
But
I want to address the other 2 points you brought up. When we talk about this new Bretton Woods agreement, one thing that I worry about a lot with Trump's administration is other countries are not going to trust us anymore, because how many deals has Trump ripped up, including the USMCA that he himself negotiated in his first term? Now he's trying to get another Iran nuclear deal after ripping up Obama's, where it's like, why would any country want to agree to an economic Bretton Woods arrangement with us when they're like, okay, if he wakes up on the wrong side of the bed tomorrow, this deal is just off. We have to constantly be afraid looking at Truth Social to see what Trump is tweeting out at like 3 a.m. about whether or not he likes us. And like, again,
we already talked about this, like with the predictability. There certainly is a valid criticism that with a lack of predictability, both businesses and countries might be less likely to invest. But I think that there's advantages to the lack of that predictability as well. Like, for example, take foreign policy-wise economics out of it. Do you think there was potentially an advantage that would stop Russia from invading Ukraine while Trump was there, because they're like, this guy might be unhinged?
I don't think so, no.
I certainly think. I think that our enemies feared,
But like,
maybe what the Democrats say about
nuke Putin or something.
Maybe. And I want a president. I don't want a president that would nuke him, but I want a president that our enemies fear, like, look, we better toe the line because we don't know what this guy would do.
This is like, what is it called? Like the madman theory of global politics. I think Nixon also tried to do this as well. There has to be like, the issue here is like, Trump being this unpredictable, crazy, wild guy who might just kill you one day and hug you the next day doesn't hold up to scrutiny when you see the types of circumstances that cause him to change the tariff rates. And I really quickly want to address this. You are correct that the U.S. has massive economic leverage to get away with a lot of twisting people's arms and trying to get them to agree to stuff. The issue is when you abuse your leverage, people rush to start depending on you less. We're going to see the same thing with NATO countries, where sure, a lot of NATO countries now are probably going to spend more on their own defense because this post-World War II order where the U.S. is a security guarantor of West Europe is not really going to be durable under Trump. Be that what it may, when other countries are less reliant on us, we use up all our leverage, and then soon we have no more leverage. These countries like shit, Trump can really kick us around right now. So for now, we'll play ball, but now our long-term economic goal is to separate as best as we can from the U.S. because they're going to twist our arm to do whatever they want to do.
But the problem is the status quo was already them taking advantage of us. Just like there were reports under the Brennan CIA when it came to 2016, we heard all this. 17 intel agencies said that Russia interfered to help Trump. Actually, the CIA buried a report that said actually Putin wanted Hillary to win. Why? Because she's status quo and predictable, and they knew exactly what to expect for them. With Trump, it was unpredictable, which meant that they wouldn't be able to take advantage of the situation in the same way they were under Obama, where they invaded Ukraine. Under Biden, when they invaded Ukraine, they knew they could get away with it, right? So the idea, real quick, not take it away from the tariff, but the madman theory, whatever you want to call it, like the proof's in the pudding when it comes to foreign policy. Under the first administration of Trump, the world was far more peaceful than it was under Biden, who was considered the safer foreign policy expert, etc. These allies, and China's certainly taken advantages, and these allies have as well. Not only have we financed their defense, but they continue to do things like not only put up trade barriers and tariffs on things like our automobile industry, but even worse than that, they're going after important American businesses like X and social media. Our money is going to NGOs that are then funding places like the European Union to push for censorship of American companies, to censor disinformation, or fine them things like $1 billion. If these groups refuse to do that, or these U.S. companies refuse to do that, then what happens is they'll either be fined into oblivion or they'll be forced to remove access to those world markets, which will ensure that a competitor from another country will swallow them up. So the idea that it's like, well, they'll eventually move away from us and not rely, that would be preferable to an advantage where to a situation where they're intentionally taking advantage of our weakness. So we
have the upper hand with most of these countries, though.
Then why didn't Biden stop them from censoring places like X?
Well, we're talking about
trade, guys,
right,
and then we'll move into closing statements.
I know social media companies have had issues expanding to markets like China. That's sort of a separate issue than like trade deficits
business
and tariffs. it's business, but there's a lot more private sector involvement there than when we're talking about tariff policy and the president's sort of like disposition towards
I
the
think
global
that
community.
speaks to a trade barrier like that would be similar and akin to the things that we're criticizing with tariffs. If you have foreign nations that are supposed to be our ally that are basically fining U.S. companies, like one of the big things that was the agreement with sort of the old order of the United States, like post World War II, was this idea: if it's good for GM, it's good for the United States. So when we did color revolutions in South American countries or in African countries or in Middle Eastern countries, one of the things that happened was U.S. businesses got access to those marketplaces, but the argument was it benefits the people of the United States. It benefits those businesses. Now we see that those businesses aren't hiring U.S. citizens. They're offshoring to other countries with cheaper labor. And this idea of protecting U.S. business interests when it comes to businesses that are centered in the United States, like social media, there seems to be more this globalist push that it's more important to censor the internet and have control. And so presidents like Biden, and more importantly, the bureaucracies that were behind that human vegetable, went ahead and allowed funding to go to places like the EU to take advantage of U.S. companies, because the more important agenda is censoring U.S. citizens that would have a pro-populist message. So they're taking advantage of us, and that is something
this
goes
again is another example of something that I just can't speak on because I don't know what specific NGOs you're referring to. If you want to give me something, I can Google later on. I'm happy to read about it. Sure. But when we're talking about this entire theory here, the point that I'm making is that when you have leverage as a global superpower that the US definitely does have, how you use that leverage dictates how durable the leverage is. And I think we're playing a very risky game where we're trying to sort of like, milk the cow dry right now and then have nothing left down the line when it might be more important. And that can be pushing, like, is it not worrying to like Japan and South Korea were meeting with China to stand against US tariffs? Like, we are pushing a lot of people into the arms of China when earlier than that, there was a lot of capital flight from China. But now it's like, okay, if I invest in the US, if I build a factory in the US, am I going to have to pay 40% taxes on my imported materials or 10% taxes, or am I going to get an exemption? And then it also raises the question of corruption, where Eric Adams is just the tip of the iceberg here. Does it not worry you that private companies can now go to Trump and try to like win him over to get exemptions on the tariffs?
Last point here, Robin, then we're going to move into closings.
It certainly would be a possibility, but that possibility could be the same on anything. Certain companies could have went the opposite way and petitioned Biden for subsidies, or petitioned Biden for certain.
Biden doesn't have unilateral authority for subsidies, though. That's Congress, and Trump is unilaterally putting in tariffs.
Well, did Biden unilaterally put in tariffs against China?
Electric car stuff you ramped it up. Yeah.
So then the same thing would have been the interest of the status quo. We also saw that, like, the way that, again, it's not just Congress. You're right that Congress has the power of the purse with something like subsidies, but the devil's in the details of how it goes. So we saw that Obama allies like Solyndra were getting these subsidies that then walked away with hundreds of millions of dollars without producing one electric car. So this was also baked into the status quo. Like, yes, I think you have a point on the predictability of this, but I think that because we both agreed that the status quo was not sustainable, and there were no politicians that were coming, certainly not Kamala Harris, certainly not Joe Biden, certainly not George W. Bush, that were doing anything to radically shake up the status quo, and the bargaining position of the United States is at its highest point that it will be right now, that now is the time for a radical change. If this radical change, if Trump would try to slow walk it and just have slow incremental change, he would have to ensure that people that share his vision would win in perpetuity for like the next 15 to 20 years, because as soon as we get a globalist back in there, like a Joe Biden, or more importantly, the bureaucrats that are running it, they don't give a shit, as they've shown for decades, about the working class in the United States, and they would have went back to the old order. So he needs to make radical change now, get these deals enshrined. Will it work? I don't know. I think it'll not be as good as he says, but it'll be better than we had in the status quo, which still, unfortunately, I don't think will be enough to save us in the long run. But it could be the start of radical change that would lead to that. And I think once you can see that the status quo is not sustainable, I applaud you for agreeing with that and having other ideas on how to fix that. But I don't think that there was any politician that was on the horizon that was doing that. So when we ask, is the Trump administration a success? I say yes, because at least they have highlighted that point when it comes to this, and they're trying some radical change. And who knows, one of us might look foolish 2 years from now when we look back and we say, how did that work? Were there trade negotiations? My guess is we'll both say we were right, because there'll be some form of trade negotiation. You'll say, well, that negotiation actually wasn't much better than the deal we had. And I'll say, bullshit, it was great. And then
you and me will both be sitting in CCON. You're like, damn, Adam, you were right about that.
Maybe.
Well, guys, I'll schedule the debate for 2027, the rematch, Rob and Adam. Guys, this has been an absolutely fascinating debate for me to listen to, and the chat has been absolutely on fire tonight. You guys have both been on fire as well. I appreciate the good faith debate. You guys handled the interruptions really well and everything. So yeah, that was fantastic. I really enjoyed that.